Good afternoon, guys. Welcome. So today we're going to talk about the RPA, the Residential Purchase Agreement, which is going to be the most important document, obviously, in your entire transaction. So I went ahead and I printed out the RPA in its entirety, which includes some other disclosures, car forms, lumps them together, or zip forms, however you'd like to refer to it. So anyone watching at home, you'll definitely need a printed RPA to refer to, and I find it quite helpful to write notes on the RPA. So we're going to start at the very beginning in the order that it prints with the disclosure regarding agency relationship, also referred to as the AD. So anytime you have any kind of contract written, be it a listing agreement or a buyer offer, and I'm not, it doesn't really matter how many buyer offers you write for the same buyers. This document, the AD, needs to be part of that package every single time you write a purchase contract or a listing contract. Okay, so I'm gonna quickly move on to the next document, which is the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent. So once again, same thing with this document. It should be signed each time you write a contract with any buyer or seller. And the reason being is that you don't know if you will be providing dual representation. You don't have to personally, as the agent, represent both buyer and seller to be in a dual agency. What a dual agency refers to is that the same broker is. You never know what's going to happen, so cover your bases, make sure that's signed every time you have a contract out. All right, the next document in the package is the Wire Fraud and Electronic Funds Transfer Advisory. So it's become somehow very common for scam artists to go ahead and find out about a transaction, somehow pose as escrow after getting contact information for your clients and emailing fraudulent wire instructions out to clients. So this has become so common in the past few years that this is now a required document with our purchase contract. I highly recommend making sure that you have your client and maybe do a conference call and go ahead and contact escrow together and verify the wire instructions that your client receives. In this case, you'd be representing a buyer to make sure that your buyer's funds actually make it to escrow. Because once those funds are wired out, it's a federal crime and there's no real way to easily get those funds back, if any at all. And it certainly puts your buyer at risk for being able to complete a purchase at that point. Here. Just a copy of the purchase contract. We're on page 1 of 10 of the RPA. All right, so moving on. To our purchase contract. I like to start at the very top where it says date prepared. I'd like you to circle that date prepared. I've had clients who become concerned because this date prepared is not the date that they sign or receive acceptance, which in their mind they might think in error that it would affect their contingency periods. That is not the case. This date prepared is simply a document reference date. It will be referenced time and time again throughout other disclosures and in escrow instructions and things like that throughout the transaction. It's a legal identification means. So date prepared is just the date the document is prepared, and that's how it's legally referred to. All right, moving on to 1A. This is an offer from, and this is where your buyer's names are going to go. You'll probably want to check with your clients to make sure that you have their names correct. Sometimes you may assume that a husband and wife share the same last name. That may not be the case. I always like to ask because it's easier to put it in correctly up front than it is to correct it later. Okay, moving on to 1B. The real property to be acquired is, and here's the address. So a nice thing to do when you're writing a contract is to go ahead and check the legal description somehow. If you're writing a purchase offer, you probably should have went ahead and asked title for legal investing, asked the listing agent for any special terms that needs to be written into the contract, and ask for the seller name. Sometimes you might see on property records a seller name as a trust. it's not always listed properly. So I like to ask. You can clean these things up through escrow later, but I always like to set my best foot forward and try for a straight acceptance with my offers versus counteroffer terms. So back to the address. For instance, Studio City, Sherman Oaks. These are actually City of LA. And so if you have asked title for the legal description of the property, it will actually say in the legal description, you know, block 1 in tract ABC. What you're looking for is the part where it says in the city of. The reason this is important is, you know, though we are local and most of the escrow we work with is local, not everyone is, not every agent is. And so they may be confused as far as the legal city. And that's important because, especially with escrow, the legal city dictates some special items we might need for our transaction, such as retrofitting or a building report. If I write in here Studio City, the listing agent could be out of area or their escrow could be, and they may not be aware that those things are required. Moving on to C is the purchase price. On the right-hand side where it has the number, in car forms you'll actually type that in and it will go ahead and spell the price out for you so you don't have to do that. We'll move on to D, close of escrow. So typically in our industry, close of escrow is somewhere between 30 and 45 days. In rare instances where it's an as-is purchase or an investor, they may be purchasing all cash, they may be purchasing sooner than that. The other option is, as far as the close of escrow is concerned, is to check that first box and then type in a finite date. I don't like to do that. The reason I don't like to do that is because I have no idea how many rounds of counter offers we'll have. So if there are many rounds of counter offers, or the seller or the listing agent is out of town, or my buyer is going out of town, well, at that point, the process of negotiation for acceptance of the contract could extend into weeks. If I wrote a finite date, all of a sudden I've lost valuable time in order to prepare for closing, for my buyer's lender to prepare for closing, for inspections, all of those things. So be very careful when you write a finite date in here. Anyone have any thoughts as to why you might write a finite date in here?
Well, sometimes I guess if time is of the essence, let's say somebody has to move by a certain date and...
Yeah, a 1031 tax deferred exchange, right, where the buyer has a deadline to purchase, maybe where they are in temporary housing or relocating. And then I have seen people who are superstitious or have belief in numbers and numerology. They may want a specific date written in. That does happen on occasion.
The Chinese 1-8.
Yeah. So just if that's the case, be certain to be aware of the fact that you could be cutting into valuable time you need to process the transaction. All right, moving on. We're going to go to 2, agency disclosure. You'll see that that box is already checked in car forms. The reason being, the very first page we talked about is that disclosure regarding agency relationships, and car forms automatically checks that box for you. It should never be unchecked, and that document should never be missing. All right. 2B, the following agency relationships are hereby confirmed for this transaction. So the first line, listing agent, is most likely going to be another brokerage or agent, but it could also be an agent within KW. If that's the case, and it is a KW agent, the line below you'd be selecting both the buyer and seller, even though that agent is not necessarily you. Dual agency has to do with the brokerages, just to reiterate that, not with the agents. But in this case, or most cases, you're most likely going to be writing an offer on someone else's listing or another brokerage's listing. So most commonly, you're going to be selecting the seller exclusively for the first agency selection in item B. But if you go a line below that in 2B, you'll see selling agent. Well, if we're going over the RPA, most likely we're definitely representing the buyer, right? So this is where you'd list in the full name of your brokerage, which is Keller Williams Beverly Hills. And like I said, most of the time you're most likely going to be representing the buyer exclusively, but if it is the same brokerage, you would be selecting the buyer and the seller. Yes.
What if it's another Keller Williams, the listing agent is from another?
If it's another Keller Williams office, technically they're all independently owned and operated, but not many people know that. And I think that there is a larger parent company, so that I would go on, be safe versus sorry. I would select both buyer and seller in that instance. I really would. All right. Moving on to item 2C, potentially competing buyers and sellers. This refers to that possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, which was included in the beginning of this package. And it's automatically also checked because CarForms includes that in your offer package. So that should always be checked. That's just another fail-safe for you to remember to make sure that's in your package. Okay, so we're gonna move on to 3A, initial deposit. Anyone have an idea as to what our industry standard is for the initial deposit or earnest money?
3%?
Yeah, 3% is industry standard here in Los Angeles. This initial deposit is also referred to as EMD, or earnest money deposit, earnest funds. And this is, just to make a quick note, that 3% is going to be taken away from the rest of the total down payment percentage. So let me give you an example of that. Let's say your buyer's going for a standard 80-20, 80% loan funds, 20% down payment funds for the total purchase price. Well, out of that 20% they're putting down, you would really be writing in 17% lower on this document. Because this 3% plus that 17 is going to equal their total 20. I've seen oftentimes mistakes where someone's writing in that 3, and then for the balance of down payment, they're writing in an additional 20%, and then their buyer is now bound to put 23% down because of a clerical error. So be careful with that. So you're going to type in on item 3 the 3% deposit, and the way that our standard boilerplate language is written in our contract, you don't have to modify anything in this section as far as checking boxes, because our contract dictates that the initial deposit should be wired directly to escrow. Why should it be wired directly to escrow? Well, first off, escrow won't normally take personal checks. They certainly don't take cash. I'm gonna date myself here, but back in the day, we used to actually take broker deposit checks, deposit them into our brokerage account here, and then send a check over to escrow, usually a cashier's check. This would cause delays, and your initial deposit is typically required within 3 business days. That's important to note because this is the only contingency in our entire contract that is written on business days. Every other contingency is written on calendar days. Anybody have an idea as to why this contingency is business days versus calendar days?
Because the escrow company is not open.
Right,
The
bank
not
and
open.
escrow company is not open. So what does this mean? This means that if I have acceptance on a Friday, the first business day would be Monday. So my client's earnest money deposit wouldn't actually be due until Wednesday. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 3 business days. Same thing though, if it was accepted on Saturday or Sunday, it would also be due on Wednesday. What was I gonna say? So even though a deposit is due on Wednesday, it's important for you guys to keep in mind 2 things you should note with your clients. Number 1, most banks require a buyer to go into the bank in person in order to initiate a wire transfer of more than 10K. Not everyone, but most banks. So you'll need to make sure your buyer knows that, because a lot of people think they can initiate this wire online, and they can't. So that might cause a delay. The other thing is most banks have a wire cutoff time, generally in the 12 to 1 range, 12 noon to 1 p.m. range. So if your client is waiting until that 3rd business day to initiate their wire transfer, you'll need to strongly encourage them to do it first thing in the morning so that that wire is actually received that same day. All right. We're going to go ahead and move on to item 3B, increased deposit. So this is not a common term that we write into the contract, but it does happen sometimes. Couple examples, an increased deposit might be required if it is a new construction and the buyer has negotiated with the seller to make modifications to the property, or if it's a particularly long escrow and it's a way to bait the seller into going ahead and agreeing to that. At the end of 30 days, we'll give you an increased deposit. What's very important to note, whether you're representing the buyer or the seller in a transaction that has an increased deposit, is that the way our contract is written, no more than 3% of the deposit is up for grabs should there be a failure on the part of the buyer to close, unless, and I'll refer you back to this section 3B, unless car form, and this is at the very end of that section, RID is executed. This RID would stipulate that more than 3% of the purchase price would be up for grabs in the case of a buyer's failure to perform or close.
So what does RID stand for?
I honestly don't remember off the top of my head. But if you go into zip forms and you actually, in the search bar for documents, type in RID, it will pop right up.
So the seller can take that increased deposit if this form is signed, is that what you said?
So yes, if this form RID is signed, then the seller may be entitled to increased funds from the buyer. Is that a guarantee? Not necessarily, because if a buyer and seller don't mutually agree to cancel an escrow and mutually agree about what to do with the buyer's deposit funds, even if the buyer is at fault, then the case would, then ultimately, after everything, after mediation and all of that, they would end up in court, and it would be a court order that dictates how much. And honestly, it would be up to the judge. Most of the time they follow the contract to the T, and our documents are very well written and versed to protect the seller in the case that a buyer fails to perform. So that's why this special form is required just for that. Okay, so moving on to item 3C, all cash offer. This box should be selected if it's an all cash offer. There are rare occasions where your buyer may be uncertain as to whether or not they want to purchase cash or with a loan. You would not select this box. All right? There's another way to write that in, and that would be down at the bottom under section E, additional financing terms. The language I like to use if that is the case is that the buyer reserves the right to obtain contingency-free financing at their sole election. Basically binding them in to purchase the property under any circumstance, cash or loan, but it also allows for the buyer to get a loan.
Can you repeat that?
Yes. The buyer reserves the right to obtain contingency-free financing at their sole election. So this is important because let's say your buyer decides they want to go ahead and get a loan. Well, the seller doesn't have to actually cooperate or sell the property to them unless they purchase the property under the terms they offered in their agreement. So that's why I don't select the all cash offer, because it is not at that point. Okay, so I'm gonna flip back up to section 3D, loans. Most of us, when we're writing purchase agreements, are going to have a loan involved. The number to the right is where you type in the percentage of their loan, which would typically be for a residential purchase anywhere between 10 and 20%, most often being 20%, but it can be lower. You would get this information from your buyer's lender. I like to get this information new every time I write an offer for a client. The reason being, the terms may change, their credit may change, loan programs may change depending upon how much time has passed since your last contract you wrote for them. So I always, if I have time and the ability, like to call up the lender and go ahead and get new information on that.
Quick question.
Yes.
How long does it generally, that they would consider the person's like credit or loan, if they've been pre-qualified, to have become stale? Like generally, what is the
I don't know that there's necessarily.
Like, let's say the person that wants to buy this house.
Yes.
They gave an offer maybe what, 5-6 months ago at another house, do they have to get requalified? Like, what is that time period that becomes stale that they have to?
So there's no time frame on that. 5-6 months, I would definitely say you want to talk to the lender again. If it's within the same week and in the same price range that you're writing an offer for,
Okay.
probably don't need to, but if you are able to, better to be safe than sorry.
So you as their agent would call the lender?
Yes.
Or, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the first things I do when I start talking with my buyers about writing an offer is I put my lender on alert, right? Because what if I don't get that offer together until later that evening, or they want to think about their offer price? I may need to ask for, some lenders include the purchase price on their pre-qual letters, so I may need to get a couple from him. In the case that we're not sure what price we're going to offer, or we're going into a weekend, something like that. I always like to, the second I think I'm writing an offer, loop my lender in. Hey, here's the property address, here's the price range we're looking at, can you please let me know what terms, because you'll also need to know what terms you're gonna write in for the buyer, right? 5-6 months ago, there could have been a huge shift in interest rate changes, right? So you wanna get these interest rates right, so that you're not tying your buyer into something that doesn't work for them, or that is no longer attainable.
Well, the terms as well as the prospective buyer's qualification.
Yes, I mean, qualification doesn't have as much to do with the terms as you might think, right? I may be qualified for dozens of different loans, but each loan is gonna have a different program, rate, deposit amount, that type of thing, right?
That's what I mean is, like, let's say they're buying the property for $1 million.
Yes.
You wanna make sure, like, how much money do they have for the down payment, their bank account, their credit history, credit score, that's what.
Well, honestly, most lenders don't pull credit for pre-qualification. They usually go based off of a loan application where the buyer is stating their financing. This is not the same as a buyer stated loan, okay? Very different. The initial pre-qualification is based upon a lengthy discussion and some documentation exchange between the lender and the buyer. And only after you would enter into contract would a lender typically, not always, typically run a buyer's credit. Why? Because if the lender continues to run the buyer's credit, it's gonna drop the credit score slightly each time. So, and also when they submit the loan for approval to whatever bank they've applied with, if they're a mortgage broker for the buyer, or even if they're a lender, they're probably gonna have to pull a credit report within a very short time frame of when they actually submit for formal approval.
Right, but then the buyer can not necessarily get out. Like, let's say the buyer wants to, like, back out. They generally, I think, isn't the general terms, like, within 17 days, no questions asked, the buyer can walk.
Yes.
But
So the question is about the buyer's ability to walk based upon the loan. Our standard for loan contingency in our market is 17 days. In the contract, I think it's actually written in boilerplate 21.
Wow.
Because I think that's more standard other areas of California, but we'll discuss that as we go further along.
Right, no, I'm so sorry. The
Oh,
only
you're fine.
reason I'm asking is because you say that towards, like, you know, the end is when they run the credit.
Oh, no.
Does that
After
count
you
into
have
the buyer?
acceptance,
Oh.
then the lender is going to start seriously working on the loan as far as doing things like running credit.
Okay.
Yeah. We generally wait for an acceptance though, because we don't want to put the buyer at risk of dropping their score, which would maybe in turn cause them not to qualify for the best loan. Okay, so down below in section D1, this is where you write in those terms, right? So you're gonna get these from the lender. You're gonna write in a rate that it shouldn't exceed, and if it's going to be adjustable, you would need to select a box for that. Also, the lender may require payment in something called points. Generally, at least now in our real estate market, I haven't seen a loan that exceeded 1 point in a long time, but that's a question you ask the lender also, even though that's not really something you'd be aware of or be expected to know what it is. Points is generally 0 or 1%, or 1 point. Reason you're gonna get this info from the lender is because once you write something in here, let's say you write a 6% in here because you didn't talk to the lender, right? And you don't know what the buyer's rate's gonna be. Well, what if the buyer can't afford to buy the property at a 6% interest rate loan? And what if they only qualify for something outside of their price range or their comfort level? Well, all of a sudden you have now contractually obligated the buyer to purchase a property under terms they don't like or want. Probably not gonna get any repeat business out of that. There are other ways to cancel a deal, but don't put yourself in that situation. Remember, you're your client's representative, and you're also sort of a coordinator. Get this information directly from the lender, and then the liability is off of you, okay? All right, section D2. This is for a second loan. Not very common in our market now. However, when money and loans are easy to obtain, oftentimes you'll see a secondary loan. You will on occasion see this second loan, not common, but it's filled out the same way that the first would be. You're gonna refer to the buyer's mortgage broker or lender and get that information if there is one, okay? D3, FHA or VA. FHA is for a federal loan, VA is for a veteran's loan. There are very, very specific requirements involved with that, and that's a whole lesson in class in and of itself. It's not common here. The reason why is because there are purchase price limits as far as those two programs are concerned, and most property in Los Angeles area, Beverly Hills area, is going to fall at a higher price that doesn't allow for these types of loans. However, it does happen, and if that's the case, your buyer's lender is gonna be your best friend because they're gonna walk you through all of the things that need to happen. There are some very unorthodox requirements with these types of loans. Sometimes they require the seller to do repairs or pay for fees that a buyer would customarily pay for. So a lender can walk you through all of that. All right, moving on to section 3E, additional financing terms. Well, we talked about writing in a buyer's right to reserve contingency-free financing here. But you may have some unusual items on occasion written in here. Let me see. So for instance, you do have an FHA or VA loan. You may want to write in here to make the seller and the listing agent aware, because like I said, it's not very common in our market, about some of the things that the lender might share with you, like the lender's requiring that the seller pay for the retrofitting and do it up front, or pay for some sort of escrow fees. Also very common with short sales, although there's a completely different contract for a short sale. So just a side note, we have many RPAs. We have RPAs for income property. We have RPAs for commercial income property, meaning that it's over 4 units. So anything 4 and under is income property. So it's residential income contract. Anything over is a commercial deal. We have probate purchase agreements, and we also have, and I'm sure there are more, and short sale purchase agreements. So side note there. Section F, balance of down payment or purchase price. So if you have written in your 3% deposit above, this is where that remaining 17% would go. Or if you have a 10% down, this is where that 7% would go. Or if for some reason your buyer really wants a property and there are 20 offers on it and you wrote in a 10% earnest money deposit at the top, this is where the balance of whatever down payment the buyer's putting down would go. So let's say it's a standard 80-20 and for some reason you have a high initial deposit of 10%, that's where 10% would go. So make sure your numbers add up. If you've done everything correctly, your fail-safe to check it is in the line down below on the right-hand side. This is where your total purchase price is going to be. It should match the same number up at the very top where we talk about the purchase price. All right, we're gonna move on to page 2 of the RPA. Verification of down payment and closing costs. This is section H. So, would anyone accept an offer from buyers who didn't provide proof of funds? No. On occasion, I'll have a buyer who's not comfortable and says, I'm not going to show my proof of funds until we have an accepted offer. And it may be very difficult, but you'll have to explain to them, well, the seller and the listing agent aren't going to take our offer seriously, because why would they respond to our offer or accept it when they have the opportunity to accept an offer where the buyer is showing them that they have the ability to purchase the property. So in section H, if you are doing your job properly and expect to have a chance at acceptance or a counter offer, the box there, verification attached, should always be checked. So, along with this entire package, you're gonna have 2 documents that accompany your offer, maybe more. You're always gonna have a proof of funds, and if there's a loan, you're gonna have a pre-qualification letter. Sometimes you're gonna have a letter to the seller, basically an emotional appeal that your buyer should write, and you'll wanna keep that sort of vanilla. I like to look at them and revise them for my clients before they go out to make sure that they don't have any political views, anything that could rub any person the wrong way. A lot of times if you have pets or children, they like to include photos of themselves with that letter. I strongly encourage that. I think the only time I wouldn't really encourage that would be is if it's a developer client.
For the proof of funds, if they, like you said in that example, that they don't wanna show their proof of funds, but they say they're not gonna make a loan contingency, would that satisfy you?
No, not at all.
Why?
Because even more so at that point, I feel like the offer is suspect. No loan contingency, well, if you have such a strong ability to be able to purchase, then you should show me the money. Jerry Maguire, show me the money, right? I'm not gonna tell my seller that that's a valid option. Let's look at the other offers, or let's counter them back and say, sure, this looks good. Here are other terms, but we will not accept unless you supply the proof of funds.
And from the time that you get the offer from the client,
Yes.
how much time do you have to respond as the seller, whether you're accepting, rejecting, countering?
Well, that would be subject to some of the terms on the last page of our contract. So we'll go over that a little bit later. All right, so Section H, verification attached. Just a side note, FYI, verification can be screenshots, account statements, right? You do want to make sure it has your client's name on there, okay? If it doesn't, it shows a corporation, LLC, anything like that, a trust, you're gonna want to probably also provide, if it isn't clearly apparent through the name of the account holder on your proof of funds, you're gonna probably want to supply some documentation showing, oh, that trust belongs to my buyer. Oh, that corporation, here are the articles of incorporation that says that is my buyer's company, okay? So make it clear, set yourself up for success. It's fine if there are multiple accounts and you're providing 3 pieces of documentation to add up to the proof of funds. And just an FYI, proof of funds should always show enough for the buyer's entire down payment. So if we're doing a standard 80-20, 20% of your offer price plus 2%. Why? 2% is the max level at which you can generally, as a rule of thumb, estimate a buyer's closing costs. You need to show, technically, proof of funds for buyer's cash portion of their offer price and closing funds, closing cost funds. So that would be anywhere between 1% and 2%. If you show proof of funds for 22%, you're good, all right? Some buyers ask me, I have $2 million in this account. Should I show that proof of funds? I think so. Absolutely. Show them that you have more than the ability to purchase this property. Some people don't like doing that, or they think that it might cause a seller or a listing agent to think that, some buyers think that might cause the seller or listing agent to counter back at a higher price because clearly the buyer can afford it. I don't think so. The reason being is, as an agent, when I submit my offers, I always like to say, especially in that instance where I have a proof of funds for a really, really high dollar amount, clearly my buyer has strong financials and the ability to purchase the property. And based on those on-market comps, we're offering, blah, 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 purchase price. And, I sometimes even like to include the comps. But, I always like to include that verbiage based on recent comps for the property. We are pleased to present our offer for blah, 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 purchase price, which we think is a competitive price. Obviously, if you're writing an offer under what you would consider market value, you wouldn't include that language, but this is also something to drop in the negotiation with the listing agent. If they start referring to your buyer's ability to purchase based on their proof of funds being high. Is that, well, yes, but just because my buyer has a large amount of liquid assets does not mean that they're willing to overpay for property. So I think any professional agent is going to understand that. All right, so moving on to appraisal, contingency, and removal. If you have a loan, almost always this box should be left unchecked, because our contract says that the agreement is contingent upon a written appraisal. When might it not be? Well, it might not be if you're making a cash purchase, but your buyer may still want to have an appraisal, and they might not want to purchase the property if it appraises far under their offer price. So even if they're a cash buyer, I'm checking with my buyer to find out if they want an appraisal. If they do, I am writing a contingency in here, because if it comes in $50,000 under their offer price, chances are they're not going to want to pay what they offered.
So there's no really benefits of checking that box, right?
No, but it makes your offer more competitive if you don't have an appraisal contingency. So if your buyer is an investor client who doesn't care, or they're an experienced client, or just an adamant client. Remember, we don't make decisions for our clients. We advise them to the best of our ability, and it's their decision. We have a duty of obedience to them. So there are times that they might not want to go in with appraisal contingency. If there's a loan, though, and your buyer is saying that they want to do that, you better get on the phone with the lender right away, because it's probably not a safe bet, and if they're hearing it from also the lender, not just yourself, you can probably sway them over to your side. So the way our contract is written is that the appraisal contingency is standard of 17 days. I would leave that in here. Why would I leave it in here? In order for my loan to be fully approved, the appraisal needs to take place. And once it takes place, sometimes it takes the appraiser a day to write the report, and then that report goes to a special department at the lender called the Appraisal Review Department, which is part of their underwriting process. It takes them typically 3 days to review that. So all of a sudden, I now have 4 days. So not only do I like to make sure that I have a valid number here, because the industry standard for loan contingency is also 17 days. If I can, I contact the lender and I ask them, can we write 14 days in here for the appraisal contingency? Can we get it done then? If I open escrow, I also like to remind my buyer's lender or mortgage broker, hey, remember, we only have 14 days for that appraisal. Please order it right away. Meaning that if we have 14 days, hopefully they get on it and review it, so that I have a little cushion between my appraisal contingency deadline and my loan contingency deadline, since this one can't happen without the appraisal. Okay? It also gives you some time to negotiate if that appraisal comes in low. Moving on to section J, loan terms. Loan applications. Within 3 or blank days after acceptance, buyer shall deliver to seller a letter from buyer's lender. So that is not typical here with us. Typically here with us, if there's a loan as part of the terms of the contract, you would go ahead and select the checkbox at the end of this paragraph, letter attached. That is, for all intents and purposes, your pre-qualification letter. All right? If anyone is missing a copy of the contract, I have copies printed up here. This is my first day recording, so those of you that came in late, I was asked to repeat questions that come in from you guys. So sorry if that sounds funny, but I'm going to repeat your questions so that anyone watching the recording can also get the answer, okay? We're going to move on to section J2, loan contingency. This is just language that talks about the buyer's contractual obligation to go ahead and accept and perform under the terms of our contract for the loan terms we've written into that contract. Just reiterating, that's why we get all of that information for the loan terms on page 1 directly from the lender. Don't make yourself liable for this. Okay, we're going to skip to J3, loan contingency removal. So it says within 21 days, But here in our market, it's typically 17 days. So you may want to write a note in there that says 17 days. Sometimes we might have 21. Anyone have a...
Is it for jumbo 21?
Even with a jumbo loan, a lot of lenders are able to perform under 17 days. But once again, this is information you're going to want to get from the lender. Sometimes I have a buyer who's just fallen out of contract, and so the lender has actually already submitted credit reports to their lender, so they have a harder loan approval, and I might be able to put a much shorter time frame in here. So there are special circumstances depending upon where your buyer's at. I would ask the lender, but typically 17 is what I'd write into here if I could. 21, especially with a hot property, you might not get acceptance, or you might get a counter. And remember, we're trying for straight acceptance if we're able to do so at all. One of the times I might write or leave it as 21, or maybe even higher, is, so for instance, I recently went into contract before the holidays, right before Thanksgiving. So I knew that 2 days for Thanksgiving was going to be out of the question for loan processing, Christmas and New Year's, right? So I think I wrote 23 days in here because we literally went under contract the day before Thanksgiving. So keep those things in mind, and make sure that if you are writing a higher than 17-day number in here, that when you submit your offer, you notate something in a little email to that listing agent, or you pick up the phone and you call him or her. Hey, listing agent, I just wanted you to know that I wrote in a higher contingency time frame for the loan only because we're losing 4 or 5 days with all of the holidays, okay? So just make sure that if that number's higher, you're setting up an expectation as to why, so that your offer is presented in the best light possible to the seller. Much easier to have a seller accept a 21-day when it's coming from their listing agent than it is, or 21-day when a valid reason's coming from their listing agent versus renegotiating it after receiving a counter. All right, so moving on to section J4, no loan contingency. So,
What
yes.
that exactly means, like remove the contingency? What if they don't give you the loan after? So I don't understand this.
So the loan contingency protects the buyer, okay? Contingency means this is a term that has to happen exactly as is stated in our contract in order for the deal to go through. And if it doesn't, that it allows for recourse to cancel, grounds to cancel. That's the difference between a term and a contingency. A contingency allows a party to the contract to cancel. There are contingencies that protect just the buyer and contingencies that protect just the seller, and some that protect both. For the most part, sellers don't have much of an option or ability to cancel once they've accepted a contract. The buyers have tons. So if they don't get approved for a loan within the terms you've written into the contract, the buyer can 100% cancel and should receive their deposit funds back. Cancellation of an escrow is by mutual instruction and agreement between buyer and seller always, but if they didn't agree and the buyer canceled under a protected term in your contract, ultimately if it went to court, the court is going to rule in the buyer's favor. So contingencies for the most part are protecting our buyer in our contract. Does that answer your question?
Yes, but
Okay.
I don't understand the 17 days. What means, like
17 days from the date of acceptance
17 days
The-
for get the loan
for the buyer to get formal loan approval and remove the contingency. Yes.
Okay. And
Yes.
if after that period finally they don't give you the loan?
If after whatever contingency time frame you've written into the contract, the lender doesn't approve you for the loan, well, you can renegotiate an extension or release some funds and try to get the seller to allow you to have more time. You could receive a notice to perform from the seller, and they could try to cancel the deal on you.
If they cancel, do you finally lose the deposit or no?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
If finally, imagine that the lender needs more time for give you the loan, and the buyer don't want to wait or whatever, and it already passed the days of the contingency, does you have the right as a buyer to get
Yes.
back your deposit?
As long as you have not lifted a contingency, even if the contingency time frame has expired, the buyer still has the ability to cancel the transaction protected,
Mhm.
okay? All right, so moving on to J4, there's a checkbox here that says no loan contingency. So, it used to be that when you had an all cash offer and you selected all cash offer under your financing terms on page 1, you would also select this box, no loan contingency, because there was no loan. However, this term doesn't apply whatsoever. So if you happen to have an all cash transaction and you select all cash on page 1, card forms will not allow you to check this box. Why? It's not a relevant term. It's not an option at all. So when would you use J4 and actually select that box? If the buyer is so qualified that their lender tells you you can go ahead and offer their purchase.
3%.
What's that?
Is it their 3%?
No, you can go ahead and make an offer with no loan contingency. So let me give you an example. I have a client who buys a rental income property through me. They had like $35 million in the bank. They have a special private banking relationship. Clearly, of course, I double checked with their lender, but clearly I can go ahead and make their offer non-contingent on a loan. So yes, they're getting a loan, but it's not a contingency. Why? There's no way in the world that that buyer is not going to qualify for a loan. And why would I do this? It makes your offer much, much more attractive to a seller.
So based on the information you get from the lender, then you check.
Yes, lender, and also you need to make sure that your buyer is comfortable with it. But of course, you'd explain this to them, and this would only be in rare instances, like I said, with really high net worth clients. Or sometimes builders will be getting a loan, but they'll be getting a hard money loan, and they'll know these terms and they'll tell you if they want to write that in. Okay, so we're going to move on to J5, lender limits on buyer credits. So you don't necessarily need to understand this terminology, and you probably won't for quite some time, especially if you do things properly, like I'm going to tell you about right now. So sometimes when an appraisal doesn't come in, or when you have some inspections, the seller and buyer may negotiate and elect for the seller to give a credit to the buyer in lieu of making repairs or a reduction to purchase price. If your buyer has a loan, their lender actually does have a cap limit as to what they will allow the seller to credit the buyer. And the technical terms for this would be toward either recurring closing costs or non-recurring closing costs. Non-recurring meaning one-time fees. Title and escrow fees are going to happen one time. What doesn't? Interest, tax payments, things like that. So you don't really need to be totally aware of these terms, but if you negotiate a credit, before you even type up or sign off on the documentation, I would pick up the phone, call the buyer's lender and say, hey, so we've negotiated a $12,000 credit after inspections. And be very careful. Make sure you have these conversations with the loan officer or the mortgage broker only. If you talk to another person involved in the loan, they may be in underwriting. A red flag, a red alert alarm might go off. Oh my gosh, what's wrong with the property, right? Because they're risk assessing. So, loan officer, mortgage broker, nobody else on the loan side should be hearing this. Just ask them, so hey, what's my, we've negotiated a 12K credit. Is that okay? Do I need to apply it in a different way? What's the max credit? They may require that you apply some of it as a reduction of purchase price or all of it. They may not require anything at all, it may be fine. If you make this negotiation, documentation that's signed for this total amount needs to go to your loan officer or a mortgage broker and escrow right away. Why? Because it's going to affect the terms of the loan. Okay? I can't tell you how many times at the last second a lender issues loan docs and we find that we are now delayed 2 weeks because the lender wasn't aware of a credit. And what does that mean? They need to go and reprocess the entire loan, redisclose, and there are timeframes involved with that. Let's see. So moving on to K, buyer stated financing. This is very uncommon now, but this was very common prior to our real estate market crash. Buyer stated financing basically says that the buyer is not going to provide documentation to a lender or a seller regarding their ability to qualify for and pay a loan. After all of the banks went under because they did so much of this, very uncommon. There are some loan programs out there based on bank statements and other things. That would be something that's a little unusual, and a lender is going to know about well in advance with your buyer and tell you about, and generally has a higher interest rate. So not very common, not very typical. That's what that section is referring to. All right, so we're going to move on to 4. Also, not that common, but as the real estate market starts to slow, or if it does slow, will become more common. So section 4 is sale of buyer's property. This agreement and buyer's ability to obtain financing are not contingent upon the sale of any property owned by buyer. Or B, this agreement and buyer's ability to obtain financing are contingent upon the sale of property owned by buyer, as specified in the attached addendum, CAR Form COP. So, I know this is going to be confusing, but if your buyer needs to sell their property in order to purchase the property you're writing an offer on, it's called a contingent offer. Since we have so many contingencies, that is very confusing. But if you hear the term, it's a contingent offer, they are referring to a buyer needing to sell a property. This is not so common right now. The point being, why would a seller want to tie up their property in a transaction when they have no guarantee that the buyer will ever have the ability to purchase their property? When might it be more common? Well, if I am representing a buyer who is in escrow on their home, the home that they currently own, all contingencies are removed, and I'm far along in that escrow, it's usually a safe bet at that point that it's a done deal. Then I might start looking with that buyer and start writing contingent offers. And what would I make sure of when I'm submitting these offers? I would probably provide an MLS printout of their home showing the status as pending. I would probably show them an estimated closing statement from escrow that shows the seller's, my buyer, on their sale, their proceeds from the sale of their existing home, because I want to give the seller and listing agent all the information required to show that, even though this is a contingent offer, this is a pretty good bet. This is like money in the bank almost. So set your buyer and your contract up for success if you're going to write a contingent offer. When might it be common that you would submit one without those items? Well, if we have a really down market, or a property listing has been sitting on the market for 6 months, at that point a seller might be a little more willing to look at a contingent offer where the buyer is not in escrow with contingencies removed. Maybe even sometimes they're not even in escrow, they're maybe just on the market. At that point, as the listing agent, you would really want to do some research and see if that property is priced appropriately, look at the photos, so you can help your seller make an educated decision and guess as to whether or not it's a safe bet to bet that this buyer's property is going to sell easily, quickly. All right, so under section 4B, the very last portion of that paragraph, CAR Form COP. So if you select B, that this offer is contingent, there's a whole CAR Form document for that. It is a very complex and lengthy document, and if you are a newer agent or you just haven't written a contingent offer in a while, I strongly encourage you to go to our broker, someone like me, a mentor, a very experienced agent, and complete this document with them, because there are so many options on this document. It just came out this last year. It's newer also, so people aren't as familiar with the new contents, and it's confusing. So read, reread. If you're not certain, make sure somebody else takes a look at it. All right, addenda and advisories. So you'll notice that on the right-hand column, about in the middle, buyer's inspection advisory is checked. Why? It's included in this package at the end of the purchase agreement because it's an addendum to the purchase agreement. On occasion, you are going to go ahead and have other documents that are attached. So let's start at the beginning, 5A. The first one is backup offer addendum. If you're submitting an offer for backup and you know that at the time you're making an offer, you're gonna go ahead and select this box. Card forms will automatically pop in that form. And why are these checked? Because if you have an addendum to the contract, it is actually part of the contract. And escrow and a lender are going to need that in combination with the rest of these documents in order to start processing the escrow or the loan. Think of it as one doc the second you add anything to this. Let's see, what else? Septic well, not all that common except for septic, and you'll see that a lot in Hills properties. Malibu, I know, has some wells and some septic as well. Short sale addendum. We actually have a short sale purchase agreement, at least we used to, unless something changed, but our market doesn't have a lot of short sales, so I won't guarantee that answer. If you're ever in doubt as to whether or not you need a short sale addendum or there's a whole contract for it, if you go into zip forms and you type into the document section search bar, you can type in short sale, and anything associated with a short sale is going to automatically pop up, and that will show you very easily, do I need a special purchase agreement or do I just need an addendum? Excuse me. On the right-hand column, addendum. So sometimes there are complicated terms to a sale. Sometimes there's a complicated leaseback. Sometimes there are a lot of exclusions or inclusions or unusual terms in a contract. And it doesn't fit on the lines that are already part of our RPA contract. So this is where you would select that box and type in the number, and automatically car forms will generate an addendum, but you have to remember that it's now going to be at the, it's also going to be in your transaction for car forms, so you're going to need to remember to go back into that addendum and actually fill it out. Court confirmation addendum. What that is referring to is a probate sale. However, there is a probate contract. So use the probate contract, but if you already have written your contract and you've made a mistake, you can also select the box for court confirmation addendum. If you're selecting this box, if you skip over to section 5B now on the left side, just below where we were looking, you'll see the very first selection that you can make is probate advisory. So if you have a court confirmation probate, there are two, one with court confirmation, one without. I teach a whole class on that, we won't go into that. But if you have selected court confirmation addendum, you should also be selecting probate advisory, because you can't have court confirmation without it being probate. You can have probate without it being court confirmation, however. All right, section B. If your buyer or the seller are in a trust, and it wouldn't be common for you representing a buyer to write your offer in the name of a trust, but it would be very common for the sellers to own the title to a property in the name of a trust, you're going to select this box. And that card form TA is automatically going to be generated and pop into this. All right, short sale information and advisory. Same thing, if you have a short sale, you're going to select this box, but I strongly encourage you, if you have a short sale, to go to a very experienced agent or a broker, or me, someone in the office that can guide you through these things. Now on the right-hand side, I told you this buyer inspection advisory is already selected, so we'll skip that one. Down below is statewide buyer and seller advisory. So, I'm not sure where this started, but it was pretty common some time ago for this box to be selected and the statewide to be made part of the contract. I don't ever do that. The reason why is because that document is like 10 or 11 pages. And remember, I told you, once you select a box here, that document literally becomes part of your contract. That contract is an advisory. It doesn't have any place for the buyer and seller to complete information. So I keep that as part of the disclosure package, because why do I need to make my RPA 10, 11 pages longer? And it's also a very scary looking document. Why? Because it goes over anything and everything a buyer could possibly want to inspect or be worried about. And most of the terms in it, they probably will never have to worry about. All right, below that, REO advisory. Okay, so an REO is real estate owned by the bank. This means that either the previous owner has forfeited their title in lieu of a foreclosure, or they've been formally foreclosed upon. There are some special things that happen in these types of deals. And if you are writing an offer on an REO, you'll want to select this box so that an advisory pops up, and it will be a good prompt for you to discuss certain things with your buyer, like the fact that the bank may require them to apply with them for a loan, that the bank may require them to pay all of the closing costs. Now, this isn't a 100%. The bank in each instance will dictate what terms with the listing agent are going to be applied. But at this point, your buyer doesn't really have much of an option. So I like to make sure that I discuss every single scenario and worst case with my buyer when they're making an offer on an REO property. Once again, not a common thing. So see someone who is a very experienced agent if you're writing an offer on one of those types of properties. All right, other terms. So I might have, I might be lifting some contingencies, or I might be requiring that the seller provide a report or do some work preemptively in the beginning of my contract, right? So let's say I'm writing an offer on a property that's on a hill, and I know there's major foundation issues or retaining wall issues or something like that. It may be that I've discussed this with the listing agent up front, it's fallen out of escrow, I have reports, and preemptively, I'm gonna write into here that our offer is subject to the seller doing this work. I don't wanna negotiate it later, I wanna negotiate it up front since I already know about it. That's just one of many examples. So this is just another blank place to write in terms. However, most of the time you're gonna wanna be very specific on how you dictate terms. My guess is it wouldn't fit here. So let's use my example again about requiring that the seller do some work to a major structural issue. I'm probably gonna have an addendum so it all fits on there, because I'm gonna wanna say, done per the specifications on an estimate dated blah, 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 provided by blah, blah, blah that the seller gave to me, performed by the same company or another licensed contractor, and permitted. You know, I wanna be very, very specific as the buyer's agent as to dictating how that very sensitive work is done, making sure it's done properly. So we'll move on to 7, allocation of costs. Will someone prompt me when it is 1:30 so I can let you guys move your cars? 2:30, excuse me, yes. So moving on to allocation of costs, section 7A, inspections, reports, and certificates. All right. So the first item is buyer or seller shall pay for a natural hazard zone disclosure report. It's important to notate that this report is non-negotiable. It is required by the state of California on every single sale there is. No getting around it. It costs about $99, and it is industry standard that the seller pays for it. However, if you want to make your offer a little bit more attractive, or you know, let's say you have a buyer who's making an offer on a property that's not listed, or not expecting to sell, you might want to sweeten the deal and try to change their mind by offering that your buyer pays for some things that the seller typically would. Plus, it's a nice feel good. You can make your buyer's offer look a little more attractive for about $100, give or take $50. So down below that is prepared by. Oh, it's important to note that these checkboxes on the right, including tax or environmental, these aren't very commonly checked, but sometimes they are. I'm honestly not super privy as to the information that's in it. I haven't had a buyer ask for that in a very long time, but we do have NHD classes, not NHD, natural hazard zone disclosure report classes in this office, and they like to provide lunch, and they would go into detail with you about that. Those services are add-ons, and they are not required by the state, so that's a negotiable item. And like I said, you know, it's not very typical, so if you're presenting an offer, it might make it look a little less attractive, but it might not. It might be important based on your property. I would go ahead and take that class, or call up an NHD company to find out what those things are and why they may or may not be important before writing it into my contract. So down below, prepared by. So whoever is going to pay for this is typically who I allow to choose the company. Can you do otherwise? Absolutely, you can specify. But I typically want my buyer's offer to be accepted. So if I'm asking the seller to pay for it, I'm gonna most likely encourage my buyer to allow the seller to choose the company. Sometimes you will see down below this in section 7A2, most commonly, a termite report. So, a few years ago, California revised our contract to remove this. Termite report and work was contractually required on all transactions unless specifically written out. It was that the seller was to provide a termite report, and once they had that report, they would be bound to complete all Section 1 items. You can talk to a termite company or a lender at more length about what a Section 1 item on a termite would be versus a Section 2. That's not important right now. I just want you to start becoming accustomed with the terminology. But this was taken out, and the reason it was taken out is because basically the seller was writing a blank check. So you have your offer all accepted, you're in, all of a sudden we have a termite report, and for Section 1 items to be corrected, it might cost the seller, who knows, $20,000, $40,000. That's a lot of money. Now they're contractually bound to do it. They have no recourse to cancel because sellers don't have recourse to cancel unless the buyer doesn't perform. But maybe they needed that entire $40,000 to complete the purchase they were making for the home they're moving into, or for whatever their next steps were. That's why it was taken out of our contract, was because how can you obligate a seller who has no right to cancellation to write a blank check? It may make their next steps or the purchase not reasonably viable for them any longer. All right, so on that note, if you have a termite report written in here, your lender is going to want to see it. If the lender sees it and there is something to be done, most likely they're going to want to have that work done prior to giving loan docs. That will be an issue. Why? Well, if a termite company needs to fumigate, you're asking the sellers to move out of a home for 3 days to allow for that to happen, which might be hugely inconvenient. You're asking them to do that when you don't have formal loan approval. So they have no idea if their transaction's gonna close. And most of the time, well, not most of the time, what if the buyer is asking the seller to pay for it? Well, they may not agree to it. So if that's the case and the buyer needs a termite completion in order to obtain their loan, and the seller won't pay for it because that wasn't agreed to, is the buyer now gonna pay for a termite completion and accept liability for work to a home they don't yet own, nor they may never own? What if the loan fails to come through after that? So that is why we hide termite entirely from lenders and contracts. So, especially buyers who have purchased previously but not recently, they may ask you about writing the termite in here. I always explain to them, it's about $100 for the report. I like to have my buyer choose the company and get their own, because let me tell you, I've been in this business for 18 years. I've never seen anything more falsified than a termite report provided to me by the listing agent. No names, but for $100, get your own unbiased inspector that's gonna give you accurate information.
Why would they have it falsified? I mean, wouldn't they be subject to
Yes.
violating their fiduciary duties? I mean,
Disclosure, yeah. So the question is, why would a termite report be falsified? Well, you have
so much at stake.
You have some unethical agents in the world who just don't care. You have some estate properties where there could be multiple additional structures, garages, carriage houses, pool houses, gazebos, wood decking, and if there is termite damage to all those places, the repairs could get into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then perhaps the seller no longer wants to sell. So there's no really good answer. An agent should never falsify reports or ask an inspector to modify them or include or exclude anything that's not normally included or excluded. That should never happen, but it does. So, you know, I'm trying to set you up for success. You can't necessarily trust what you get from the other side. Encourage your buyer to spend that $100 and make sure you, you know, have a fail-safe, accurate termite report. because we don't have section 1 repairs written into the contract, does that mean the buyer can't ask for them? No. So that's the other most common question for buyers who have previously purchased, and they're like, well, what about the work if it needs work? Well, my answer is we typically then negotiate it during the request for repair or credit, if there is one, and just ask for credit so that the buyer can go ahead and have the property tented or spot treatment done prior to their moving in. So it's something that if we get a credit for, I might advise my buyer, hey, just want to have you keep this in mind. You may want to go ahead, and this is of course after all contingencies are removed, loan docs are signed, you know when you're going to close basically. I would say to the buyer, hey, you may want to schedule your termite work for a day or two after our scheduled close before you move in. That way it can all be taken care of if it's fumigation, instead of them moving in and then having to move all of their food, animals, cosmetics, medication out after they move in. So just a good way to prepare them for that. Let's see. So yeah, we were at 7A2. That I will oftentimes see, especially with out of area agents, old school agents, agents who don't do a lot of business, or someone who was just taught improperly. They will write that termite in here. Yes.
Once you have the inspection done by the sellers,
Yes.
and somehow there's a lot of expenses that need to be fixed up because of the termite issue.
Yes.
Then at that point you have to disclose that it might be a $30,000 expense just to do the termite work.
Oh, you don't have to disclose it because the reports should be delivered to both listing agent, selling agent, buyer, and seller. Everyone. So those reports, you should be reviewing them with your buyer. Don't ever get a report and not look at it. I have seen some agents get themselves in some really big trouble because of that. But that report is the disclosure. And if there's a termite report, the termite person should most likely be discussing their findings with your buyer if they're present during the inspection. I strongly encourage that you and your buyers are present for any and all inspections, if possible. If it's not possible, I strongly encourage that you take grueling notes and make sure your buyer is aware of everything, or record the inspector, or have the buyer speak to the inspector directly on the telephone if they're not able to be physically present. Conference call them in, put them on speaker. All right? Okay. Let's see. Oh, on occasion, so like 7A2 and 3, on occasion, your buyer might say, hey, there's no way I'm going to purchase this property unless I know what's going on with that leaning wall by the hillside. So, you may want the seller to pay for a report before, or as part of your contract. That puts you in some sticky water with the lender again. So, if it was me, I might prepare some documentation that is not part of my contract, but that I deliver at the same time as my offer, or maybe make a written agreement between myself and the listing agent that the seller will provide that report. But once again, I would strongly encourage my buyer to go ahead and spend the money required for their own inspector to do that inspection. All right, so we're going to move on to page 3 of the RPA. The section at the top is B, government requirements and retrofit. So, every city, county, and state has differing requirements. City of Los Angeles requires retrofitting, which has to do with carbon monoxide, smoke detectors, water heater strapping, earthquake shutoff valves, water conservation, and I think a few other things. And also a building report, which is obtained from the city. Some cities have building reports and no retrofitting requirements. Some have retrofitting requirements and no building reports. What's the best place to get this info from so you can find out when you write your offer is to call a retrofitting company or your escrow officer that you use or have a relationship with. I would go to Pele here in the office if I'm representing a buyer, right, because I don't have an escrow officer that I'm most likely going to open this deal with. She can find out for you. 2 good resources. It is industry standard that the seller pays for all of these things. Why? Because this work and report and the expenses for them are going to be required prior to the close of escrow. Why would I ask my buyer to go ahead and write a blank check for legally required repairs, upgrades, or certifications on a property that we have no idea if they'll ever close on our own? So our contract generally is written that the seller pays for these things. On occasion, I'll see, especially with a hot property in multiples, the selling agent asks that the buyer pay for the retrofitting or the building report. Make sure your buyer knows that, the building report, at least in the city of LA and most cities, is anywhere from like $70-something to a couple $100. I think like Manhattan Beach, Redondo Beach, if I can remember off the top of my head, and Hermosa Beach, the 3 little cities down in South Bay. I think 2 out of the 3 have a building report. I can never remember which one, but I do know one of them, at least a few years ago, was in the hundreds, like the $200-300 range. But our standard LA building report is somewhere in the $70-80 range. Retrofitting is all going to be based upon what's actually physically at the property. Do they need to install carbon monoxide detectors? Do they need to install a earthquake safety shutoff valve on the gas line? So we don't know as the buyer's agent if these things are done. Even as the listing agent, there are specific requirements as to how these are done, where, the number, the thickness, specifications as to the work and how it should be completed. So it doesn't mean just because you see carbon monoxide detectors, smoke detectors, strapping on the water heater, it doesn't mean it's done properly. So there's no way for you to know what that's going to cost. So if my buyer is going to take on this responsibility, I make sure they know it can be anywhere between $0 to have work for this done, and only $99 for the retrofit inspection or so, or it can be hundreds of dollars. I've seen a couple instances where there are a lot of bathrooms and they have to replace low flow toilets. I've seen it in the couple thousand once or twice. That's not standard. That's gonna be like on a huge estate home, but you never know. So just make sure your buyer is aware that we can't predict this cost, if they accept responsibility for payment of those reports and work. Okay, so we're going to move on to section C, escrow and title. So if you are representing the buyer, who standardly chooses what escrow company we use? Yeah, typically in our market, that's a competitive market, it's a seller. If our economy shifts, however, and the real estate market slows, property begins to sit, prices start to go down, it is more common then for a buyer to make specifications and demands. At that point, you might be writing in your escrow company. Because remember, I want the best opportunity for straight acceptance, not a counter, not a rejection on my offer. So I want to make this offer as appealing as possible to the seller and their agent. There are a few rare instances where, as the buyer's agent, even in our current market condition, you might specify who your escrow holder is going to be. So let me give you an example. I had this elderly client who did not do DocuSign. He was making a purchase on a property where the listing agent was also the owner. It was a rental property for her. But she lived out in Palm Springs. So she, I made a call and I talked to her right before I submitted the offer, and I said, hi, Joy, I wanted you to know that I wrote my escrow company in here. And it's not because I'm trying to get my people. It's because my buyer is literally, he just doesn't do DocuSign. And I have to physically go to him every single time he signs something. And he's going to have to sign things with escrow, and he has a loan. He's going to have to sign loan documents. And there's no way he's going to drive 2.5 hours out to Palm Springs to do a live signature every time. So can we please have our escrow company, which is located right next to him, just because of that? And any reasonable listing agent and seller is going to understand that. Another common situation where the buyer might dictate what escrow company is if the buyer is selling their home or is about to close on the sale of their home or has a contingent offer. Why? Because they need the proceeds maybe from that sale to close on your transaction. So if the money is staying within the same escrow company and same title company, you're not losing time. It's much more likely to go smoothly. You only have to give information out to the escrow company once for that particular, your buyer, who is also the escrow company and title company's seller on the other property. So those are the times that you might dictate that. All right, so also on section C1, at the top line, A, you have two boxes here, buyer and seller. They should both be checked in most circumstances. Why? Because it is industry standard that each buyer and seller pay their own fee. So next to that selection, after you select buyer and seller, I would like you to write in, almost always, the exact phrase, each to pay their own as customary. Why? One of the more common mistakes I see when I receive a purchase contract is buyer and seller to split escrow fees 50-50. Why is that not accurate? Well, as a former escrow officer myself, what does that mean? It means I add up every expense closer to the close of escrow, and I split it down the middle, 50-50, and each pays half. But that's not fair. Why? Because if the buyer has a loan, they're gonna have a lot of loan fees associated with loans that get paid through escrow. If the seller has a bunch of payoffs or extra work that the escrow company has to do, they're going to have fees associated with that. Maybe the buyer is, someone who, an actor, actress, model who travels internationally all the time. I'm gonna have tons of messenger and notary fees and things like that. So, right, each buyer and seller has different fees based upon their personal circumstance during the deal. So, almost always this should be each to pay their own as customary. If you receive a purchase contract that says 50-50, you should be countering out 50-50 to say each their own as customary. Or if you'd like to otherwise just accept the offer, if you're the listing agent, just call up the buyer's agent and say, hey, can you please rewrite that so we can sign off? All right, down below that, section C1C, parties shall within 5 or blank days after receipt sign and return escrow holder's general provisions. You don't really need to be concerned with this. It got included with the contract when they revised it, I don't know, 2-3 years ago. It's because buyers and sellers weren't responding to escrow at all. They weren't giving them their escrow package, which is very important because escrow cannot move our transaction along without buyer and seller info that they need. They can't process the loan, they can't prep the grant deed because the buyer's vesting goes on there, a lot of things. This is behind the scenes stuff, but I always take this time to explain to my buyers and or sellers that it is very important you respond to escrow, and if it's a buyer, your lender, right away. Why? Because they're sort of wedding coordinators the entire transaction. Sure, you can want to purchase, sure, you can want to sell, but unless they have the information they need to process the documents and tasks that they associated with that closing, that sale, they can't do it. All right, so section C2A, buyer or seller shall pay for owner's title insurance policy specified in paragraph 13E. Who pays for title insurance? Maybe. For that specific policy, typically, yes. So there are two different types, there are lots of types of title policies. There are two most common types of title policies. The first one is the CLTA policy. This is the seller's policy. This protects the seller. This is what this line is talking about. And the seller generally pays for the CLTA. So you would select here, normally, that seller shall pay for owner's title insurance policy. Now, the second most common type is ALTA. If you look at the very last line in this paragraph, C2B, it says in parentheses, buyer shall pay for any title insurance policy insuring buyer's lender, unless otherwise agreed to in writing. That's your lender's ALTA policy. If you have a loan, it's required. There's no getting around it. That's why it's boilerplate language. So this is also a common spot where buyers and sellers get confused. ALTA, buyer, buyer pays. CLTA, seller, seller pays. Now, I think it's important to note, sometimes you will get a Northern California agent writing on a property here, or you will be writing an offer for a client that wants to purchase in Northern California. There are some different industry standards in different regions, even of our same state. It is common for the buyer to pay for the title policy for the owner in Northern California. So if you're making the offer in Northern California, you probably want to advise your buyer to offer industry norm there that the buyer pays. If you're receiving an offer from a NorCal agent who writes that in, you may just want to pick up the phone and say, hey, I know for you guys buyer normally pays, but for us seller always pays here. So it makes your offer look a little strange in presentation against the other offers we may have or have received. All right. So also, typically the seller is going to dictate the company that issues title. But in the same circumstances we discussed about the rare times a buyer might dictate, for escrow, it's going to apply here. So buyer is selling a property and it's easier to keep escrow and title within the same company for both their sale and their purchase. Or they need someone near them so that they can sign documents, things like that. All right, so we're going to move on to D.
Should we stop here because it's about 2:30?
Oh yes, good time to stop, thank you. All right, so go ahead and take, do we need 10 or 15 to move the cars? 10? Okay, 10-minute break, I'll see you guys at 2:40.
When does the class end?
4.
4 o'clock.
Quick question, I wanted to ask you, so, I put this on.
All right, so we were at other costs, correct?
Yeah.
So back to RPA page 3, D, other costs. We're going to start with section 1. So the first two are county transfer tax and city transfer tax. It's industry standard that the seller pays for these, right? Because the seller is the one receiving money on their purchase. However, in the instance where a property has multiple offers, is very, very competitive, a buyer might offer to pay for these. It's very important to note that these two separate taxes, one is for county, all LA County, one is for city. City tax rates vary by the city. In Los Angeles, after you combine those, I think it's something like $4.50 or even higher than that per thousand. So if you have a $2 million, $3 million home, this can be a lot of money. I would refrain from ever calculating these taxes myself as an agent, whether or not I represent the buyer or seller. If the buyer's offering to pay for it, I would go to my escrow officer. I would go to Pele in our office and ask her if she can help you to figure out approximately how much these will be. And remember to be careful and overestimate. If your buyer wants to make an offer offering to pay for the seller's typically paid taxes, you'll want to estimate high so that they're covered. I recently was just working with a friend and past client on a purchase that they made. They offered to pay the seller's taxes on something because there were so many offers on this property and they really wanted it. And they wrote with the listing agent because they really wanted to get that property. And she misquoted them. She told them only about, I think, the county transfer tax? Well, one or the other. In any case, she told them about whichever one. I think it's $1.10, and that might be the county. And it's significantly lower. If you add in the $3, $4 additionally for the city, it was almost 20 grand, I think, more than she had quoted them. So I advised them to go to their broker, their agent's broker. That brokerage ended up crediting my friends that entire amount because of the agent's mistake in misquoting. So that's why stay away from it. If you start giving numbers as an agent, who's liable for that? Really, you and your entire brokerage. And if that client is upset, well, first off, you're not going to get repeat business or referrals. But secondly, they may go to your broker and that may come out of your commission. Depending on what your commission check is even for, it may eat up the majority of your commission. So protect your money, protect your client, protect your rep, get that referral and repeat business. Make sure you stay away from providing info that you don't have the answer to or are not qualified to provide. Use the people who are available to you, like escrow and title. In this instance, escrow could help you calculate that. All right, so we're gonna move on to D3, homeowners association. This section only applies if there's a condo or a gated community, also called a planned unit development. Basically, if there are common areas, shared roads, gates around the properties, or if it's a condo complex. Or freestanding townhomes a lot of times are part of an HOA. Always better to double check than assume it's not and not write this in. So if the property does have an HOA, which stands for Homeowners Association, then you would need to select one of the boxes here. Typically under D3 and in our market, the seller pays for homeowner documents and transfer fees. In fact, if I would say that almost any and all HOA fees are customarily paid for by the seller. So you'll see as we go along in this section D3 and lower, that most of these have to do with HOA or transfer fees. So 3, 4, which we don't need to select, 5, 6, and also 7, I would select seller if it's an HOA. Now there is one document that typically the buyer pays the HOA for. It's the lender cert. So if the buyer is obtaining a loan, the lender will send out a document either to Escrow or directly to the HOA, and you'll probably want to babysit this because lenders oftentimes mess this up. They'll send a document out to the HOA company to complete directly, providing information to the lender, which might affect their choice as to whether or not they're going to make the loan and at what rate and that sort of thing. And typically, because this is for the buyer's lender, the buyer would pay for that loan lender cert. Sometimes it's called an HOA cert, sometimes lender
But
cert.
it's not one of the options here.
No, it's not, because it typically is just paid for by the buyer because it's for their lender. All right, so 8, 9, I don't know if I've ever used these boxes. You may find some reasons to. If that's the case, just make sure you read it, bounce it off someone who knows what they're doing, and make sure that it's clearly written. All right, D10. So, standardly, the seller pays for the buyer's home warranty. The home warranty company, cost. The home warranty cost should be completed. This is a maximum allowance for which the seller will pay for the buyer's home warranty, including any optional coverages. The cost would be calculated based on usually the square footage of the home and grounds. So if it's just a little bitty condo, I'm probably gonna write $550, $600 in there. If it is a small single family, I'm probably writing $750, $800. If it is a huge single family, I'm probably writing, I don't know, maybe even up to $1,500, $2,000, a huge estate.
Do we check this with the home warranty company?
So seller, you would check most of the time. Then you'd write in the dollar amount. When in doubt, go ahead and call a home warranty company and ask them what you should estimate. Always better to overestimate than underestimate. The other important thing is, I always, no matter what, select at the far right, upgraded. And then you have to, below that, write in the company that your buyer wants a home warranty with. Most of the time the buyer selects this. Why? It's their home warranty policy and they all cost about the same. And below that, with the following optional coverages. Unless, so I check everything here except pool spa, because I can easily tell if they don't have one. If they don't have one, don't check it. But I select air conditioner, unless I know there isn't one. Doesn't matter what kind, wall, central, I select that. And then I select, just like I've written in here, other. And I always write in buyer to determine prior to the close of escrow. Why? There are so many optional coverages on a home. If you don't have that written in here, your buyer is limited to what's listed in the contract. They can have more coverages, especially if they have a huge allowance, right? Why shouldn't they add more coverage? So unless you write in exactly as I've written in here, buyer to determine prior to close of escrow, they're limited to what's there. On occasion, a buyer will either pay for the home warranty, or below section 10, the next checkbox where the bold or is, you would check there, the buyer waives the purchase of a home warranty plan. When I'm trying to make my offer competitive for my buyers in multiples, I oftentimes encourage them to go ahead and waive the home warranty. Why? Because it's anywhere, depending upon the size and type of home, anywhere from like $500 to a couple grand. Most of the time being in that $600 range, because most of the homes I sell are under $3 million. So why? It makes the offer look really attractive to the seller, and it's not a whole lot of money. It's sort of like that marketing ploy, you know, where you'll list something for $1,999,999 instead of two.
It all depends on how much competition there is and
Yes.
how hot that area is.
Yeah, the only time I'm suggesting to my buyer that we might want to waive it is if we're maybe in multiple offers. And if I really have a strong feeling that we're going to receive a counter offer anyhow, I might save it for the counter offer process. Why set the bar higher when I know I'm gonna get a counter, right? I don't wanna be the one that drives up the ultimate purchase price. I don't wanna be the one that starts stripping away buyer perks.
You always leave room for
Right,
negotiation.
right. Yeah, maybe the seller wouldn't, or the listing agent wouldn't think of asking for us to waive that. And so, you know, there are 3 other offers right at the same price or something, and at that counter time, I advise my buyer, let's go ahead and waive these couple of things, and maybe that's why they accept us. So yeah, I never like to be the one to start it, but I like to be the one that finishes it, right? All right, so move on to D8, items included or excluded from sale. So if you read through this section, it is pretty self-explanatory, but I will make a couple of notes for you quickly. The rule legally is that anything that is attached to the property is considered automatically included with a property at sale. This would mean light fixtures, this would mean curtain rods. Curtains and drapes are supposed to be included. That's one of your gray area ones. When in doubt, you know, if there are really beautiful window treatments, I would just write it in as an inclusion, even though it's technically covered. That's one of those things where you wouldn't necessarily, as a listing agent, think, oh, the curtain panel is attached, because it isn't really, right? So when in doubt, write it in if your client wants it or doesn't want it. Make it clear, even if it's written here, but that's a general rule of thumb. Television mounts are generally included, unless otherwise dictated by your contract, but the TVs aren't. So those are the 2 items that I run into difficulty with most of the time, where it's not super clear as to what stays or goes. So always be clear, rather reiterate it than be wrong. Make sure you have expectations there. Also, one of the things I ask the listing agent when I submit an offer, anything I need to exclude. Well, he might say, oh, well, yeah, the sellers want to take their washer and dryer, or that $20,000 antique light fixture in the dining room, in the formal dining room. That was a gift from her grandmother. She wants to take that with her. All right? So, you know, make sure you ask, make sure you write, make sure you double cover. So under B2, at the bottom, you would select boxes for the appliances. So an important note on this is it says existing. I hate to write an offer on a property I haven't physically seen, because I can't write the best offer as an agent. But there are times that you might have to do it, such as your buyers go into a Sunday open house, there are multiple offers and the deadline is that day or the following morning. You may not be able to get in to see the property. So when in doubt, what do? I select all of these boxes, because if they're not there, they're not existing. The seller's not obligated to purchase them if they're not already in the home. But I'm selecting and reserving these things for my buyer in the case that they are there, unless they for some reason really don't want something. And this means all. So on the far right for refrigerators, the box that says all refrigerators and in parentheses the S, a lot of times there are small fridges, wine fridges, fridges in, or refrigerators in the garage, yes. So the way our contract is written, these would all be included automatically. I've had a couple of instances where the sellers actually took the refrigerator in the garage with them, and one where I ended up having to buy the refrigerator for my client. I had written this in here, but you know, the seller and listing agent just weren't making it easy to do the right thing. So I just bought my clients a fridge, and they were nice. They let me buy them a used one. It was a pretty rough refrigerator that was in there. And why did I get in this situation? Because I wrote a damn offer on a property that I had not yet seen. Because exactly the situation I just discussed with you, a time frame, multiple offers, and no physical chance to see it.
But if you have this check all refrigerators, then
Mhm.
you're covered, right?
Yes. Mhm.
So why did you have to pay for it again?
I didn't have to. I did not have to pay for that fridge in the garage. I could have demanded that the sellers return it. If they didn't, the sellers could have taken the buyers could have taken the sellers to small claims. But, you know, I would prefer that my buyers are happy. This is an error I made. I had the opportunity when I was there for inspections to recognize that there was one in the garage, draft an addendum or try to negotiate it at that time, but I failed to do so. So what do I want? I want the rep, I want the relationship, I want the repeat business, I want the referral. So what I bought a $400 used
You mark all the
refrigerator.
X's here that they have. to-
No, in this instance, I hadn't.
Okay, that's what's the.
Yeah, because there wasn't one in the kitchen. The sellers had already moved out, and when I was talking to my clients, they're like, yeah, so there's no appliances. They also sent me photos. There's no appliances in the kitchen. When in doubt, ask the buyers, right? Because if they're the one giving you the info, they can't really be mad at you. When in doubt, check MLS photos. Your MLS photos could be different than what's there, but at least it's better than nothing, right? Ask the listing agent. I think I was literally on my way out of the country, like leaving on a plane in 2 hours, and I couldn't get a hold of her. I got it, I got the property, we closed, I think out of 20 offers, I was like, I don't know if I can get it for you. But yeah, just do yourself a favor. I don't like buying things I don't need to buy for other people. I mean, Christmas is nice and all, but you know, I operate a business, and I don't want to have to mitigate my losses. I want my clients to be happy, and I want to protect my commission. But you know, was it per se my fault? Not necessarily, but should I have been a better agent and protected them and looked out for those things? Probably. And at the end of the day, I'd rather have repeat business and referrals than $400. All right, so below this, 8.3, you can write in additional items. Common items to write in here, even though it is written in this section, would be water features, AV equipment. Those are technically attached and should be included, but let's make it extra clear, especially when you get into high-end homes. Potted plants are excluded, but high-end homes, those potted plants might really make the grounds, so you might want to write those in. These are just things to think about when you're writing offers. Let's see. Home automation, security systems, things like that are automatically included unless you select the box in 4 that they're not. Sometimes the seller doesn't actually own some of that equipment, so they may need to return it to an alarm company. More often than not now, it usually costs the alarm company more money to take the equipment back than it does to just let them keep it there. But check on those things, don't make an assumption. Leased or liened items and systems. The most commonly leased items are solar panels, or if you have a multifamily with a communal laundry room, going to be a washer dryer company that maybe has what is called a laundry lease. And basically they have a lease agreement with the owner that they most likely split proceeds on the payment that's made to use those laundry machines. And your buyer may or may not have to assume them, or the seller may have to pay off to cancel out those agreements, nullify those agreements somehow, so that you guys can close. I have seen a deal fall apart when solar panels were first becoming popular because the seller did not own them, they were leased, and the buyer would not agree to the terms of the solar panel lease. So the solar company, I think there's better regulation now and it's set up better. This is when it was newer and we hadn't experienced these problems. I hope it's set up better. They refused to budge and they wanted some crazy, like, huge payment, and the seller's like, I can't pay you that. Then I can't buy my next house. And the buyer was like, well, I'm not assuming that or paying that. So we're at an impasse and couldn't close the deal. All right, so let's see. We're gonna move on to section 8C, items excluded from the sale. So this would be like that $20,000 light fixture seller wants to keep. Could could be a $2 light fixture the seller wants to keep. These are things that we need to know about. Sometimes the seller does not want to keep something, right? I think I gave this example in a previous class for a listing contract. I had sellers who had a condo with a rooftop deck. They had beautiful large patio furniture on their private rooftop deck. Well, they paid a lot of money to have that furniture craned in because they purchased it and then realized that they didn't have a large enough opening indoors to get that furniture up to the roof. So what they said to me was, we are absolutely not paying $10,000 to have that patio furniture removed. Whoever buys it has to buy it with it, and they can keep it or get rid of it at their cost, whatever they want to do. We just want it to be out there that we are not removing this. Okay? At the very bottom, in bold, reads brackets attached to walls, floors, or ceilings for any such component, furniture, or item shall remain with the property, or your first option is to check will be removed and holes or other damage shall be repaired but not painted. Maybe there used to be two options here. So you have one of two options. Boilerplate that brackets and things like screws and nails would stay with the property. So they just basically take off what was ever hanging there and leave them. Or that those attachment devices, the brackets, the nails, the screws, are removed from the wall and that they are patched but not painted. So now you're gonna have like plaster or drywall patches. And your buyer might walk in and be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Why might this be a problem? This could be a problem because it might be a custom paint job that can't be replicated or a hard to find color. So things like that, I definitely either A, recommend that the buyer have them leave the brackets there. Who knows, by the time they move in, they may want to hang things on them in the same places anyhow. Or B, I write into different, into this section, or on an addendum or somewhere else on the contract under other terms, the brackets, nail holes, whatever, all of these attachment devices are not only removed and not only patched, but I also want them painted. So I'll give you an easy example for this one. I sold a few of all of Johnny Depp's condos in the Eastern Columbia building in downtown. The one that he and his ex-wife had lived in it was designed to the nines. They had like vault doors installed on the wall. I mean, this thing was beautiful. And they, on their largest wall in the main living area, they had probably upwards of 200 things attached to the wall, drawings, artwork, pictures. And so obviously they're gonna take all of that with them. But this wall was painted with like customed variation of tones and metallic like golds in it. And so we wrote into the contract, I represented the buyer on this particular deal also, that the buyer wanted everything removed and patched, but because it was such a unique and expensive paint job, that they also repaired the paint. All right, so we're gonna move on now to page 4, closing and possession. So when does closing take place? What is close of escrow? Close of escrow is when the actual transfer deed, the grant deed, is recorded at the county recorder's office. Once that happens, the title company works up some numbers and then they give what is called confirmation to either the escrow company or agents and escrow company. Once we have confirmation, we have closed. Closing, however, is slightly different than delivering possession. So the way our contract is written is that no matter what time a property closes, is that possession, meaning keys and the actual possession of the property, is delivered to the buyer at 6 p.m. So, you might write in here 5 p.m. I typically leave it at 6 p.m. Now, if I receive an offer and I'm representing the seller, and it says 6 p.m. in here, I've had an instance where my seller was basically a hoarder, and I knew we were gonna be down to the last second. I countered and I wrote possession to be delivered at 11:59 p.m. that evening. Why? Because I knew those last 5 hours, I'd probably be over there myself helping them, picking up day laborers, oops, I didn't say that on camera, to help us get everything out of the house. Also, sometimes you're gonna write in what is called a seller to remain in possession, or basically a delayed delivery of possession. Very different from what is commonly referred to in our industry as a rent back or a lease back. So with a seller to remain in possession, it needs to be legally within 30 days of the date of close. Why? Because anything under 30 days circumvents the automatically legally implied relationship of landlord-tenant relationship. Anything over 30 days, even without written agreement, becomes landlord-tenant relationship in the eyes of the law, the way our laws are written, which can open up a whole can of worms as far as possession versus eviction, right? So let's say your buyer buys a property, the seller and buyer agree to the seller having a 60-day formal lease after close. What if the seller doesn't leave? Now it might be a 6 to 12 month process to take them to court and actually evict them. Whereas with a delivery of delayed possession, seller to remain in possession of less than 30 days, for sake of argument and in theory at least, I've never seen this happen, the new owner, the buyer at the time, could then basically actually go to the police and report trespassing versus eviction. I don't know how that would work out. Hopefully you never have to find out, but it would probably make taking someone to court and getting an order for them leaving much easier versus going through eviction court. It's very costly as well. So this section 9, we should go back to 9A. 9A is very important for the buyer. You indicate whether or not the buyer is going to occupy the property as their primary residence. Why is this important? Anyone have an idea?
Yeah, the loan's
The
gonna be
loan,
different.
Yes, the loan terms are gonna be drastically different, and the lender is gonna work from your contract. Sometimes you're gonna get a buyer who is not sure, or will after a certain time frame. In this instance, I ask them to hash it out with their loan officer or mortgage broker, and for the lender and the buyer, or one or the other, to give me instruction directly. Why? I don't want to be legally liable for maybe for lack of a better word, gray areas that they may want to present in one light or another based on their circumstance. I want nothing to do with that. All I want to know is how they'd like me to fill out the contract.
Question about escrow.
Yes.
If you represent an investor and they want to buy out a lot because they want to build multifamily and they give a cash offer, when exactly does escrow close on those? You just open escrow and then?
No, your close is always dictated on the first page of your contract. You can modify it with an amendment of existing terms, or you can modify it through escrow with an escrow amendment. A lot of times now, escrow companies will require both. You'll draft the CAR form amendment to existing terms, AEA, and then they'll also mirror that change in terms with their own amendment. But yes, you have to have a finite date. You cannot have a valid contract without what? Property or service, consideration, and time frame. Yeah, those are all of the legal requirements for a valid contract. All right, so back to 9B, seller occupied or vacant property, and we're going to talk about possession. So we talked about the time frame on the day of close, or let's look at the line below. Our second option is checking no later than blank calendar days after the close of escrow, or at, and checking the box here and giving a finite date and time. So if you're going to be under 30 days, you can select this here, and I'll explain what form you'll use in that case. Over, you'd select here, write in that amount of days, and there'd be a different form. Or we'll skip to the end of that sentence, a finite date and time. I don't like to use a finite day and time. Why? I can't always control whether or not the close of escrow will take place on time. A lot of it has to do with the lender or things that come up during the course of the transaction and inspections that may delay things. Right now I have an escrow that is delayed 2 weeks because my poor little buyer accidentally gave them a termite report that they shouldn't have, and they required termite completion even though we had already wrapped up all the negotiations for repairs, and the sellers aren't going to pay for it, obviously, because they've already given their credit that they were going to give. So it took us quite a while to figure that out. We were trying to get the lender to let us have the buyer just certify they'd do it after close, and they ended up not doing it. So what would have happened if I had a lease back for the seller in that instance? Well, now all of a sudden the seller was expecting to have maybe 21 days after the close of escrow to get their stuff out, move out. Well, if I had a finite date written in there, now all of a sudden they'd be down to 7 days out of that 21 because I had a 2-week delay in close. Now, if you write it from the close of escrow, your option just before that, you're much safer. Much, much safer. All right, so we're gonna skip down to 9C, seller remaining in possession after close of escrow. So if you read this, it will reiterate what I was telling you about 30 days and the form SIP and the term seller remaining in possession. Or the second option just below that, which is for anything where the seller remains in the property for longer than 30 days, needing a formal lease agreement, and that is CAR Form RLAS. For the seller to remain in possession under 30 days is the CAR Form SIP. They cover a lot of the same information, which covers who covers costs of maintenance to the property while the seller is still there. It also would have a lot of ramification on legal rights for the new owners, the buyer at the time, right? If I have a formal lease agreement, they're now literally landlords. And so if they want to go in, they can serve a 24-hour notice. Whereas if we have an SIP, just a seller remaining in possession under 30 days, the new owner doesn't really have legal right to enter that home because they don't have a tenancy, right? And like I said, anything over 30 days, that relationship of landlord-tenancy is created. So you may as well get a formal residential lease after sale agreement together and go ahead and make sure that's hammered out. All right, we're gonna skip down to 9D, tenant occupied property. Property shall be vacant for at least 5 or blank days prior to close of escrow. All right, so if you have a tenant in place, depending upon where they're at, if the property is subject to rent control and what type, how long they've been there, the makeup of the existing tenants, the property owner may be able to either serve a 30-day eviction notice or a 60-day eviction notice, or may not be able to evict them at all prior to the sale, depending upon the state and city requirements. So if there's a tenant in possession, you'll want to make sure there's no rent control regulating what a seller or owner can do to get rid of the tenant. You'll want to make sure your buyer is aware of whether or not they can get rid of the tenant, and if so, under what circumstances, and if there's any cost involved. A lot of times there is relocation assistance required for a tenant. Generally speaking, rule of thumb is single family, at least in the city of LA, generally does not have rent control. Condominiums, as long as it was not an apartment conversion into a condo complex, generally not subject to rent control. They're also considered individual property. Anything 2 or more units built prior to 1978, generally subject to rent control. If it is in the city of Los Angeles, there is a website called Zemus. I can't remember the exact address, but if you Google that, you can go to Zemus, punch in your address, and in the right-hand column, there's a whole bunch of info, and it will list for you RSO, which is the acronym for Rent Stabilization Ordinance. And it will say yes or no, and you can very easily find out whether or not a property address is subject to rent control in this instance. So, if I am the buyer's agent and I'm writing an offer, and my buyer does not want the tenant to be in there, I need to call up the listing agent, find out if that's even a possibility, because why should I even write an offer if that's the case, if we can't get rid of the tenant? And if they're under rent control, Will my buyer want to pay for and qualify if the seller is not able to get rid of the tenant once they own the once my buyer owns the property? Which might require in-depth information. Does the current tenant have children? Is there anyone disabled in the home? Why? Because that might mean that my buyer, once they own the property, if they want to relocate the current tenants, if they are actually allowed to, there are very specific allowances that the city allows you to get rid of tenants for. Can they afford to do it? Because if they have 2 kids and someone over 65 that's been living there over 5 years, they may have to pay significantly more than they would if it was just someone like me, childless, healthy, and under 65. Although, if I lived there over 3 years, I would get a higher payment also, the way the city laws are written now. So find these out from the listing agent. Find out if your buyer wants to accept this responsibility. Make sure that they have access to information that tells them what kind of fees they might be required to pay, and let them make that decision. So let's say though, for instance, it's a single family and we don't have to worry about any of these things. Hopefully that's the case if you have tenant occupied property that you're making an offer on. I like to modify this section where boilerplate gives us 5 days. So under 9D, 5 days prior to close of escrow, the tenant needs to leave. I say 10. Why do I say 10?
Wiggle room?
I say 10 because it might take them, a couple of extra days. Also, the premises should be delivered clean. Maybe the tenants don't clean properly, and so the seller now, or the owner, needs to now go in and clean up after them before we close escrow. Because they may cause significant damage to the property moving out. They may be angry and purposely destroy the property. I would like to give the property owner, the seller, ample time to remedy this so that my buyer can still purchase the property happily. Or time to negotiate that they're providing us now a large credit so my buyer can do it himself after his or herself after they own the property. So time, because I cannot control the tenants. Also, if you need tenants to leave 10 days prior to the close of escrow and the tenants need to receive notice from the property owner, your close of escrow is going to be dependent upon how long of notice the seller needs to give to their tenant. So if the seller needs to provide a 60-day notice to a tenant and I want it to be vacant for at least 10 days, I need at least a 71-day escrow. So just keep that in mind if you have tenant occupied property.
But also you run into issues of if it's financed, the purchase, you run into interest rate issues.
No, you shouldn't run into interest rate issues.
Because if you're opening it now and closing in 71 days or more, the interest rates will be different.
It will be different, but the lender will do what's called lock the rate with the buyer aside and separately from you. You wouldn't, as an agent, be involved in that process. But that's why it's very important that you have the correct number of days written into your contract for the escrow period so that the lender right away is privy to that and knows not to lock that rate too soon. Okay, so we're gonna move on to tenant to remain in possession. Sometimes your client buys a property and the tenant that is there is great and it's a healthy rent and they don't wanna get rid of them for any reason. In that case, you would select this option. However, there's a better option. I would probably, if they intend to keep a tenant in place, and I know this, use a residential income property purchase agreement. There is a separate one. In this instance, if it's single family and they want to keep the tenant there, you can use either. You can definitely still use this one. If you choose to use this one, you would select this box, tenant to remain in possession. That tenant to remain in possession document will automatically be generated. You'll need to complete it, and it will prompt you to multiple things that you'll need to do in that case. You'll need to obtain information from the existing tenant that verifies security deposit, lease terms, the amount of the rents. Because what if there becomes a dispute after your client purchases the property? The former owner may not be available to verify any dispute information between the new owner, your client, and the tenant. Also, the security deposit needs to be transferred from the existing owner to your buyer at close of escrow through escrow. All right, so,
In most cases, it's more helpful to your buyer to have the seller move out the tenant than have the buyer deal with somebody else's tenant.
possibly,
Really?
possibly, I mean, they may have a tenant that they wanna keep there, they may be purchasing for income purposes, but they also, they might not be moving in or into the state for another 6 months, who knows? So, I mean, I wouldn't make that determination for your client. You can always ask them what their circumstances.
They save on the commission, the tenant is already there, so they don't have to pay another commission to find a tenant.
Maybe if they elect to even use a real estate agent to find a tenant, a lot of times you'll find property owners who own few properties will undertake landlord and property management duties themselves. So it's just dependent. Okay, let's see here. Where are we? So we are under section 9E. This stipulates that the seller assigns to buyer any assignable warranty rights for items included in the sale. What might this be? Let's say there are some appliances like a dishwasher in the house that is still under warranty. This section, if they can get that warranty info, they can take the contract to that company and say, hey, legally, there's still a warranty through our contract terms. That warranty is assigned to me, so you do still have to honor it, even though I'm a new owner. That could become problematic because I would imagine most companies are gonna dispute that. Some warranties on the manufacturer's end void at transfer. But it is a little, if you ever run into that problem, hopefully you don't. If you ever run into that problem with your client having something break and them asking you, here's a little edge on another agent. You can say, hey, well, I don't know if it'll work, but you might wanna try section 9E of our purchase contract. Let me email it to you. I'll highlight it and email it to you. That way you can send it over to the warranty company. All right, section 9F. Very important, at close of escrow, otherwise agreed to in writing, seller will provide keys, passwords, codes, and or means to operate all locks, mailboxes, security systems, alarms, home automation, internet connected devices included in the purchase price, garage door openers. If it's a condo or in a common interest building, they might have to pay a deposit to the homeowners association to get keys. Okay, so why is this important? Well, let's say you have a great transaction and you're getting ready to close and you close. Everyone's happy. The seller's moved out of state or they went on vacation. You go up to the property to let your buyer in and wow, you guys go in and the alarm's going off. Or you go to go in and there is a whole fancy home automation system and your buyer, the new owner, can't access it with a password to use it. Well, they might be a little upset. Why? Because the seller might not be super available to provide that information anymore. I can't tell you how many times I've closed and maybe it's not a required thing like we're talking about now, but my buyer has a question and I have to follow up with the listing agent 5 times to get that info. Why? Because they don't care anymore, it closed, they got paid, they're on to the next thing. So, word of advice. At your final walkthrough, or at least a week prior to close, I like to send over a request to the listing agent, or sooner, by the way, to see if they will please provide us with this information. I ask after the contingencies why. I'm not gonna ask the seller for any passwords or passcodes or anything unless we know it's a done deal, right? That doesn't sound like a good idea to me. Why else might I ask at that time? Well, because until then your buyer's probably crazy busy. I like to do it when things sort of lull to where they can focus on it. Sometimes it's very complicated and at this point when it's a done deal, even though it's not industry standard, if it's a good feeling between buyers and sellers, listing agent, buyer's agent, I might at that time even allow the buyer and seller to meet and do a walkthrough to go over some very complicated operational stuff, like home automation and things like that. You know, it doesn't really matter how well instructions are written out. Some people forget steps when they write them out, or maybe the buyer just simply doesn't understand what they've written because of the words they've chosen. So I like to have them show it to them. Or, you know, at worst, maybe have a video taken of it being minimally accessed so that I can provide that to my client. Also, it's a really nice thing to do for your buyers is ask the listing agent to see if they will get the seller to give you a list of their service providers. Who do I mean by that? Their gardener, a pool person, their pest control, maybe even their housekeeper. Why? Because when the buyer moves in, they're gonna have a lot going on, and they may not think to hire these people. They may not know what is required as far as maintaining the property properly. They may not know where things are. What do I mean by things? Switches for pool filters, access to the controls for some sprinklers on the back side of the lot. Who would know these things? The existing service providers. So I do advise my buyers, at least for the first month or two, to go ahead and continue using the same service providers so they can learn about their property. And how awesome is your buyer gonna think you are when you make everything all so simple and go above and beyond for them? All right, so we're gonna go down to section 10A1. All right, so this is talking about where the seller is required to deliver to the buyer within the time frame in section 14A, which is later in the contract, the required disclosures. These are the basic disclosures required by the state. However, our brokerage and the area we work in require quite a few more. So the items that are listed here, TDS, the lead-based paint, statutory disclosures, natural hazard disclosure statement. These are just a few of the many things that you're going to be required to obtain or provide depending on who you're representing. But this is a contingency on the seller. So in most instances, it's a buyer contingency. The buyer has to do something with a certain time frame, right? Well, the seller also has to provide disclosures to the buyer within a certain time frame. That is the one and only standard contingency for a seller within our contract. Why is that important? Well, the buyer may not want to purchase the property anymore after seeing something that's disclosed on the seller disclosures. That's why it's important. How can we expect the buyer to lift their contingencies when these haven't been delivered to the buyer? That being said, if you ever get a disclosure after the buyer's contingency has expired or been lifted, you're automatically entitled to 5 additional days to review that new disclosed item. All right, this includes avids. So, as a listing agent or buyer's agent, don't be the person that messes up the deal. Get your avid done ASAP. Provide it within the same time frame as the seller disclosures. Even if you're representing the buyer, that would extend to you as the buyer's agent. All right. Section 10.2 says that if any of those disclosures are incomplete, they're not valid. We've talked about this in disclosure class. So I'm going to skip over the rest of the section since we'll cover that in depth in any disclosure class you take with me. And we're gonna skip down to, that would include 10B. So we're gonna skip down to 10C, withholding taxes. You will not be involved in this. Escrow facilitates it. It's very confusing, however. Your buyer may ask you about this when they get their escrow package. It basically, the way our law is written, it says that buyers are responsible for making sure that sellers report their sales correctly to the state, and that any withholding taxes that may be due are provided to the state, and the buyer is responsible for making sure that happens. Escrow does this. Usually these special taxes that they're talking about are generally applied only if the property being sold doesn't qualify as the seller's principal residence, which means they have to have lived there any 2 of the last 5 years. But these are things that seller will handle with escrow. Escrow can't advise them. Sometimes escrow will have them talk to their tax person, an accountant, an attorney. I just want you to be aware of what this is, because the way documents are written in escrow, it may cause some concern for either your buyer or seller. And this is what they're referring to as withholding taxes. It's also referred to as FERPDA or 593C. D, Megan's Law database disclosure. So it used to be that there was a disclosure we had that told potential buyers all about a database where sex offenders were registered. We no longer have that disclosure, but there's just an advisory here that tells buyers where they can go check online. The reason being is, as agents, we really want to stay out of that and away from that. It's up to a buyer to go ahead and take on that investigation themselves if they'd like to, but they need to have the information where they can access that info. All right, down below, gas and hazardous liquid transmission pipelines. So I'm not sure if you've ever in your life seen warning notices posted anywhere, but I've seen, I'm not even sure where, many times in my life, where it says, stop, before you dig, call SoCal Gas or call whatever your local gas company. This item in our contract is basically just another reminder that, hey, if you're planning on digging up a yard anywhere, you may want to preemptively, during the course of your investigation period, go ahead and contact the gas company to see where those things are, so you know it doesn't mess up your plans for any modifications you want to make. And most people never read this part of the contract, by the way, but if you ever get an engineer client, like seems to be my cup of tea, they will ask you about every single item on here, so I want you to be at least vaguely aware of what they are. All right, so we're gonna skip to F, condominium plan development disclosures. This is the contingency time frame, also similar to the seller disclosure contingency. It's basically the seller is going to deliver HOA documentation to the buyer within certain time frames. 7 is a standard in here. If your buyer's contingency periods are short, you may want to shorten that. However, HOA management companies are notorious for giving you documents late, incorrectly, incomplete, inaccurate. I can't tell you how many times I have looked at the buyer's HOA document package and been like, hey, what about these? These are all missing, what about that? I think I'm probably one of the only agents on earth that actually reads the HOA docs, and I've been horribly disturbed at the errors I find in them, because the escrow company doesn't check the validity of what the management company sends over. The management company really doesn't care or doesn't have that much interaction with the HOA directly, and doesn't always keep on top of keeping files of every single meeting or any modifications to the HOA documents, which could be very important. They could modify important rules that would affect your buyer if they were going to purchase and live in the property or rent it out. Rental restrictions, pet restrictions, these are things that would make a property maybe no longer viable for your client. So read your HOA documents, make sure they're complete, and don't be surprised if you don't get them within that 7 days. So the second you make an offer on a condo, I would start asking the listing agent and escrow for the HOA docs right away. Have they been ordered? When will they be here? Making sure you get those. Also, sometimes your lender wants to see some of them. Oh, the other common thing is there may be a special assessment, meaning that in addition to regular HOA dues, the HOA has voted on increasing everyone's dues temporarily in order to fix an outstanding issue. Where would you find that if it's not already been implemented? You would find talk of that in the minutes, which are notes from each of the meetings that they have. A seller is legally required to disclose any talk of pending or upcoming special assessments, but they don't always. Why might not they always? Well, generally they are filling out their disclosure package with their listing agent, who may not be smart enough or experienced enough or care enough or ethical enough to want to discuss that or disclose it. Why? Because if there is a pending special assessment, a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, but it's pretty industry standard that you ask the seller to pay for all of that up front. If they don't know what that price is going to be, that becomes an issue. And you may need to discover what that's going to be prior to close. Why? Because you don't want to obligate your buyer to a blank check special assessment price. Okay, so moving on to page 5 at the top. It continues on about the seller requirements for requesting HOA docs. Usually escrow facilitates this on their part. Like I said, they're usually late. Try not to let them be all over the other side about getting those HOA docs. Like I said, those management companies are horrible. Sometimes they require payment up front and they won't take a credit card. It gets delayed easily. So we're gonna skip now down to section 11, condition of property. So I always think it's so funny when people disclose as is in their counteroffers. The seller demands as is. Well, what does number 11 say? 11 says that the property is sold as is in present condition, right? You're making an offer on a property you know nothing about. Of course it's as is. Whether or not you don't write it in again, whether or not the seller counters with as is, the buyer is still allowed to do any inspections they'd like to, and they're still allowed to ask for any credits and or repairs if they'd like to. And what are the seller's options? The seller can either negotiate, B, refuse, or C, completely fail to respond or acknowledge it whatsoever. The seller always has those options. Everything is negotiable. So even if it's an as is, if you find a huge problem, well, I'd ask for something. Because chances are, if you don't close, well, not chances, legally, the seller and listing agent are supposed to supply that same information to any other potential buyer or buyer they enter escrow with. So wouldn't it make more sense for them to negotiate with you and get that taken care of and just close the escrow you already have open versus going back to market, maybe not getting the same sales price, having more days on market and having to disclose that same issue anyhow? Yes. So I just want everyone to know it's ridiculous when someone counters you as is, but it's okay because it's already in your contract and you can show your buyer this language here. So you might want to circle that. This is another thing that gives you a little bit of an edge on an agent. I can't tell you how many 20, 30, 40-year agents still don't understand that all purchases are made as is. It doesn't restrict the buyer from the ability to inspect and ask for anything they want. All right. So 11A is talking about the seller disclosures and the timeframes there. And that B, the buyer has also a timeframe where they can conduct inspections and do their due diligence. And C, that we strongly encourage the buyer to do their own investigations and thorough investigations of the condition of the property. Just reiterating that, things have to be disclosed, buyers should investigate. And then under 12, buyer investigation of properties and matters affecting property, it goes over a really huge list of what they can inspect. And then it just goes into the fact that if the buyer receives information from the seller disclosures or during the course of their physical inspection contingency, if they see anything they don't like, anything, they have recourse to cancel legally. And they are legally entitled to their deposit back. Once again, that doesn't mean they'll necessarily get it right away, because in order for escrow to release a buyer's deposit, there has to be mutually signed escrow instructions. If you have an angry, grouchy seller, they may drag you guys into court, but what does the contract say? The contract says the buyer's protected, so that 3% would be given back to the buyer, along with probably damages and legal fees, which is when a seller is difficult. That's ammunition I use to remind them that, hey, the way the contract's written, it's pretty black and white. It clearly says the buyers to get their funds back. Just so you know, if you fight this, not only will you most likely have to give that back, you'll probably have to pay legal fees and additional damages. All right. Section D, buyer indemnity and seller protection for entry upon property. So the seller, during the course of escrow, should not modify anything or repair anything that's found. It should stay as is. If it's a major safety concern, something has to be repaired right now, you need to make sure that you have a written agreement between buyer and seller. Better yet, you should probably do a formal negotiation if you're making a request for repair and or credit that gets signed off on. Why? Well, because the seller is contractually obligated to maintain the property in its present condition. That's how the buyer made the offer. I was doing an Avid one time. I'm not sure if everyone here knows what that is. Basically, agent has to do a visual inspection and notate anything, even like smudges on the wall. And I was notating things like something like this, these black marks on the wall. My seller literally, 10 minutes later, I came back in the living room and he had a pan of paint, a paintbrush, and was painting over it. And I was like, you can't do that. You're not allowed to modify the property in any way. So please, don't do anything else. So the other section, part of this section D, is when the buyer does inspections. I have had recently an inspector that was taking the HVAC apart. No invasive inspection by buyer's inspectors. Why? They can cause damage. Buyer is financially responsible for any damage, purposeful or accidental, that the buyer's inspectors make. No holes in the walls. I had a termite inspector one time poking eaves that were really bad termite damage, where it basically flaked off when he was poking them. It's like some $10 million ornate house in Hancock Park, and I was like, this is not the buyer's house yet. Please stop further damaging these eaves. I've had a buyer's inspector fall through the roof or like the ceiling when they were up in the attic. Buyer responsibility. I highly recommend that my buyer only bring in licensed, bonded inspectors for this very reason. Seller is not on the hook for any of this. The only time the seller might be on the hook is if the seller fails to remove a pet like a dog or secure them properly and they got out and they somehow bit or harmed buyer's inspectors. Okay? So, clients with dogs, clients with animals, make sure your seller knows they have to be secured unless they're 100% certain that they're fine. Even then, I would probably, make sure that the buyer and buyer's inspectors were comfortable with the animals being present, even if they're completely friendly. You never know. All right. Title investing. The title report, the preliminary title report, is actually a part of the seller's disclosures. Why? Because there's stuff on there that the seller probably doesn't know about or isn't privy to. They're not a title company. They're not a real estate professional. There may be easements on here that they don't know about. What's an easement? It's a right for access or use of the property by someone other than the current owner. Utility companies commonly have easements. I see utility easements on almost every single prelim. What other kind of easements? There may be a shared fence on a property line. Sometimes there are not so usual easements, like the fact that the house behind can only be accessed by driving across the lot of the house in front. That might be a problem for your client. Who then is responsible for the mutually shared driveway repair? Things like that. So don't think that what's in a prelim can't kill your deal. It can. So make sure you have that. Make sure your client reviews it during the seller inspection disclosure period, because if they get it after, or if they have it but don't review it until after they've lifted that contingency,
It's too late.
yeah, it's too late at that point. Buyer's already lifted the contingency, even though they no longer want the property. All right. We're gonna skip over, there's a whole lot more information in that section, title investing, but it is some pretty complicated stuff that have to do with title matters, liens, mechanics liens, deeds of trust, money the seller owes, IRS liens, foreclosure, something called REAP, which I won't even go into. There are a lot of things that can affect title for seller. Uninsured deed transfers. So if you ever run into that, you're gonna see it on the prelim there, and you're probably gonna need a whole lot more help and instruction than our contract is gonna give to you. At that point, you wanna talk to a broker, manager, and title rep. Okay, we're gonna skip over to page 6. Time periods, removal of contingencies, cancellation rights. So this goes over the bulk of the seller and buyer requirements. 14A being the seller's requirements to disclose. Like I said, including those reports that are provided by third-party providers like NHD, preliminary title report. And then B1, it talks about the buyer's physical and basic overall investigation of the property. That means reviewing those reports, the disclosures, any HOA documents, doing the physical inspections. So if the buyer or seller fail to do all of this and lift those contingencies, basically assigning the rights to cancel under these terms away within the timeframes that are listed here, there are a few things that could happen. You guys could negotiate an extension for or without consideration. The seller or buyer could serve a notice to perform to whoever was failing to either provide disclosures or lift the buyer physical inspection contingency, which may or may not be a big deal. There may be a backup offer, there may not. It would probably become contentious at that point. And the rest of it goes over what the procedures are for negotiation. So I keep on talking about the buyer's negotiation for the physical. Under section B2, it tells you that it's car form RR, where the buyer can make a request of the seller for repair or credit or reduction of purchase price. Under 3, it's talking about car form CR or CC, and this is either contingency removal or cancellation of contract. So if your buyer finds something they don't like, or if your buyer fails, does all their inspections and fails to lift their contingencies, this is the instructional section that tells you, depending on who you're representing, what you can do. If you're the seller, the buyer fails to perform, you can serve a notice to perform and then cancellation of contract. If you are representing the buyer, you can then send a contingency removal, lifting your contingency and moving forward with the contract. Continuation of contingency in item 4. All right, this is when buyer and seller agree to extend that time period on any of those contingencies. That, I think it's called modification of terms is for a listing contract. Extension of time addendum, ETA, is our car form in which you would extend a time frame out, be it the close of escrow or a contingency time frame. All right, 5 is important because our contract, unless otherwise written here under section 14B5, stipulates that even if the buyer has a shorter physical inspection contingency and even lifts their physical inspection contingency, that they still have legal right to access the property for up to 17 days. I actually, I think this is problematic. I like to modify this if I'm writing the offer to go ahead and match whatever physical inspection contingency timeframe I have in there. Why? Because we may have had difficult negotiations after the inspections. The seller may have been reluctant. There may not be good feelings between the two sides. And now all of a sudden my buyer said, oh, I want to bring in someone to measure the windows for drapery, tapestry. I want to bring my sister, my wife, my mother, my cousin in. Why? Because you kind of have maybe some hard feelings there after the negotiation. And I'm trying to set without any thought as to who I might be representing. I want to try to keep everything feeling good and as civil as possible and let some time pass if that's the case. And I don't want to have to be the person that tells my buyer, no, I don't think that's a good idea, that you want to bring your mom, sister, cousin, and her daughter in. And I also don't want to be the person who has to go to the seller and be like, I know you're not so happy with them right now, but contractually, they still have the right to legal access for 17 days. They're like, they were just in here for 10 days straight. I want no one else in my house, right? So set yourself up for a better chance of success and an easier escrow, and probably modify this 14.5 time frame, if it needs to be modified, to whatever you've written in 14B1. C, removal of contingencies with offer. Sometimes you make an offer, buyer lifts contingencies at that time. If that's the case, you probably need some documentation from the listing agent up front in order to properly and safely do so. If you're going to ever lift or remove contingencies with the offer, you should probably please come see broker, manager, me, someone like that, your mentor, before you do something like that, okay? If you select that box, car forms will include the form CR with your contract. And you'll identify which contingency, if any, or all of them, you're lifting with the offer. All right, seller rate to cancel, D. Seller can only really cancel if buyer fails to perform. We've gone over this. I think I told you in my listing contract class that I had a seller one time who either lost a job or a fiance or something. He had been planning to move out of state. All of a sudden, after entering escrow, he decided he no longer wanted to sell. Well, he had to. And he was bringing things like dead cockroaches, rats, and I have no idea where he was getting these things, and like laying them all over the house, hoping that the buyer would see this during inspection and decide to cancel. The buyer did not. Clearly, they saw right through it. It was kind of a nightmare. But this is the section that talks about, that the seller cannot really cancel. They have no recourse to cancel unless buyer simply doesn't perform. All right, section DE goes over the steps, timeframes, and documentation required to provide a notice to whoever is not performing. So typically this is 2 days, and typically the form is notice to buyer to perform. You can deliver this preemptively. So let's say my contingency expires on a 10th of a month for a buyer. I'm representing the seller. If I feel like it's been difficult, I don't feel like they're gonna perform, I might preemptively serve them a notice to perform on the 8th. This is not always a good idea. It leads to a lot of icky feelings. I just want you to be aware that it is legally a possibility. The first time that it happened, I was repping the buyer. I got served 2 days before my contingency expired. I didn't know they could do that, and I was really angry, and I hated not knowing. I thought it was just invalid. I was like, go away. All of a sudden, I was like, I went to my broker, and he was like, oh, no, that is totally legitimate. You need to lift it on time. Why did the seller do that? They had a backup offer that was $60,000 higher than my client's offer. It also helped me manage my buyer's expectations. Sorry, buyer, we probably can't ask for A, B, C, and D because of this. Or maybe we should ask for a little bit less. In any case, we need to start thinking about it now because we do need to respond and lift on time because they've already served us. There is a separate document for if all the contingencies have already been lifted and the buyer just fails to close. That's called the demand to close. And the demand to close, I think, it requires 3 days. So if I haven't seen movement on the loan as a listing agent, I might serve a demand to close to the buyer for a couple of reasons. Mostly to get the buyer's butt in gear or to get a response or get them to negotiate a penalty for every day they don't close to my seller if my seller's really freaked out about it. Or let's say I had an instance once where the seller just wasn't providing their tax documentation to escrow and escrow couldn't close without it. They just legally can't. And so I served them this notice. At that point, a seller would be in breach of contract. So 3 days, demand to close. Just need you guys to know that. All right. We can actually, the rest of this is all things we've talked about, this page. So we can skip to page 7, and I'm gonna try to, everyone have an additional 5 minutes? Okay, so I think I can wrap us up here in 5 minutes. All right, so final verification of condition, commonly referred to as the buyer's final walkthrough. The way our contract is written, it needs to be done within 5 days of the close of escrow. The buyer can waive one. There is a waiver box on the VP, the verification of property condition form that is required. The final walkthrough or verification of property condition is not meant to make sure repairs are made, although that is a secondary purpose. Just so you guys know, repairs that have not been completed as agreed to is not an actually legal valid defense for a buyer failing to close. But most listing agents don't know that. So you know this. You can still probably try to bully them with that info. We refuse to close until this is done. So the purpose of the final walkthrough, besides being a feel good for your clients, maybe they can bring in their mom, sister, dad, and cousin at that point, instead of bugging the sellers after the physical inspections, is just to simply make sure the property is in the same condition then as the time it was when they made the offer. What could have happened? Well, the seller probably moved a bunch of their furniture out. What if they damaged something? Right? So at that point, that's not a repair that was negotiated. That's new. Remember I told you it's as is? It is contingent that the seller provides the property in the same condition. So that would be grounds for the buyer to refuse to close. And you could serve a demand to close then to the seller because they're contractually obligated. So if there are new damages made through the action of the seller, that's a different story. All right. The section below that, repairs, talks about how the repairs aren't actually a contingency, any negotiated repairs to hold up close. But no one reads that, like I said, so you guys know this, but the other agent probably doesn't know this. Go ahead and bully them with it. All right. Prorations, property taxes, and other items. The only thing you really need to know about this is that I tell my buyers, hey, sometimes it takes the city a little bit longer to catch up with the amount of the increased property taxes you might have to pay. What do I mean by this? Property taxes are based on sales price. So, property taxes right now are at the seller's sales price. That's how they're calculated. Well, the buyer's taxes are going to be calculated on your new sales price. Sometimes it takes the city, I've seen it sometimes over a year and a half, for the city to catch on, oh, there's a new sales price. The buyers didn't get away with anything. The city is going to come to them with what is called a supplemental tax bill. They're going to come after that money, and you're going to be the buyer's going to be liable for it. So I always tell my buyer, you didn't get one over on the city, you didn't get lucky. I want you to be aware and save properly for it. This can come out of the blue, and it's got a very short due date usually on it. Supplemental tax bill. Sometimes they get the updated tax bill right away. Sometimes not. All right. Just so you know, all real estate prorations are based on a 30-day month. So if the buyer sees their escrow statement and there's prorations based on taxes or anything else between the buyer and seller, tenant rent between buyer and seller that needs to be transferred over through escrow, even if there are 28 days in the month or 31, how is the per diem amount calculated out? 30 days. So you would actually count out 4 days left if there are 31 days, if all the way to that 31 for your actual days. But your per diem amount, you're going to take whatever consideration divided by 30 and then multiply it times that remaining day. You don't need to know that. That's an escrow thing. But if someone's like, hey, there are 28 days in this month, be like, oh, I totally get you. But real estate law says every month is prorated on 30 days. All right. Basically, Section 18 talks about broker responsibility and compensation. Protects your commissions here. 19, representative capacity. If the buyer or seller are on contract or on title as anything other than an individual person's name, this means trust, estate, Inc., anything like that, you'll have a document called RCSD, either -B for buyer or -S for seller. So if you're writing a contract and you see the name of a trust, you can expect that the listing agent needs to provide you with an RCSD-S, showing that their seller actually has the authority to act on behalf of whatever entity is listed on title and listed on your contract. Because you wrote it correctly, because you called the listing agent and you said, is this right? Is this trust right? How should I write the seller's name? All right. 20, joint escrow instructions. It just says that escrow simply supplements your contract. They don't invent new terms. They don't supersede terms. All contracts supersede escrow instructions. Escrow is simply following your instructions. That's why they need written instruction from you if you modify them or add to them. I'm going to skip on to page 8. Page 8, 21, remedies for breach of contract. This goes over what happens if people don't agree and the procedures, if they're allowed to go to court, if they have to go to mediation or arbitration, and for other types of resolution and liquidated damage caps. So hopefully you never have to go through 21. If you do, you probably need to talk to our staff attorneys, and this isn't really going to help you, but this at least can give your buyer and seller basic ideas of what would happen in worst case. Okay? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and skip on to page 9.
This section needs to be signed or initial.
Yes, They don't have to be initial. Buyer and seller don't have to agree to liquidated damages and, different types of mediation. It's very rare that they do not, however. And sometimes if one party won't and the other party wants to, that can be, a sticking point as far as getting a deal through or not. But I would say I've only had one time in my entire career where, the seller refused to select those boxes to go through those processes. All right, so page 9 goes over a whole bunch of, basically definitions and, terms and some of the, just reference to like federal and legal ramifications in the case of problems. Like I said, if any of these things are going to apply to you, you're going to need the help of our advisory attorney, and I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to go over those things. Item 31. This is the last really important part of making an offer, expiration of offer. So here you're going to write in who should receive the offer. Let's say that you have a co-buyer's agent. Maybe they're not as involved or they don't talk to the buyer. You want to make sure a name is listed here for whoever whatever agent is having the most contact with the buyer, or both of them. And then it has an expiration. So your buyer's offer is not endless, right? Buyer's offer is only good until either the boilerplate language, the 3rd business day at 5 p.m. after the buyer signs the offer. That's not when it's delivered to the seller. So let's say the buyer signs the offer and you somehow, and you should get in trouble for this, somehow you fail to deliver that offer to the listing agent for 2 days, guess what? It's only valid for 1 more day. It's not 3 days from the time you deliver it. So 3 days from the time the buyer signs and dates the offer. You can write in here longer or shorter. Why might this be important? This might be important because as long as the offer is valid, if the seller receives another offer, this means you're in multiples now. Also, your offer can be shopped. So the listing agent, as long as they have a valid offer, can say, yes, I have an offer and here are the terms, as long as their seller allows them to do so. So I might want to put a short expiration if I don't want my offer shopped. Or in the case of multiples where I know I'm going to get counters and it's going to be long and drawn out, or clients are out of town, I might write a longer one in here. If you are a seller's agent responding to an expired offer, in your counter offer, make sure you extend the expiration period of the buyer's offer. Otherwise, your counter offer is invalid.